right, I'd like to call this meeting to order of the subcommittee to review the Manual of Legislative Procedures. And Matt, maybe this would be a good time for you to just kind of go through what we're going to do, what we're trying to accomplish today. I've been looking at this, but I haven't got all the way through it. And I think we're going to really probably have to go page by page. But I want to hear what you want to see us get accomplished today.
Mr. Chairman, thank you. Matt Obrecht, Director of the Legislative Service Office. We're coming together here today to consider proposed revisions to the Wyoming Manual of Legislative Procedure, and maybe just start with letting everyone know what exactly the Manual of Legislative Procedure is. Of course, the House and the Senate have their own separate rules that govern their conduct, and they also have joint rules that govern the conduct of the two houses' cooperation and interactions together. Those rules form the basic framework of legislative procedure for the Wyoming legislature. The Wyoming Manual of Legislative Procedure puts some meat on that framework, fills in some of the details on the procedures in the House and Senate and when they come together jointly, and also for committees of the legislature during session. Mr. Chairman, per the terms of the Manual of Legislative Procedure, it needs to be updated every 4 years. That has not happened as regularly as it should have, and during last interim, the 2021 interim, staff looked at proposed changes to the manual, drafted some, and presented that to Management Council at their January 6th meeting. Due to the nearness of the session, Council decided not to present those proposed changes to the legislature at the 2022 budget session, but to appoint this subcommittee to consider those changes and then recommend whatever changes you would like to Management Council, then for presentation to the Joint Rules Committee, and ultimately to the House and Senate for their adoption at the 2023 general session. So, Mr. Chairman, if there's not any questions from the subcommittee right now, former LSO Director Dave Groover, who initially took the lead with these changes, will walk you through page by page the proposed changes, and also after he reviewed them again this summer, he has a short 3 or 4 page proposed amendments to the document that was distributed. So you'll be working off 2 different documents. First is the Wyoming Manual of Legislative Procedure. It says at the top, draft 1/6/2022. And the second one is a set of amendments that are dated, are those dated 6/25/2022? So, Mr. Chairman, with that, I'll hand it over to Dave.
Okay, Mr. Chairman, you should have 2 documents, the draft 1.6/2022, and the second would be suggested amendments to that draft. Take a step back, Mr. Chairman. The reason the manual is important is in your hierarchy in the Senate, the hierarchy of procedures are Constitution, the rules, statute, and then the manual, and then precedent. In the House, the manual is actually right after rules, Constitution, rules, and the manual. The joint rule, the manual follows in the same order as in the Senate, in which statutes are actually in front of the manual. And basically, you can look at that as statutes are basically a joint rule that have been agreed to by both sides. So the manual is important, Mr. Chairman. What we've done here is to make updates to rule numbers, technical corrections, And more importantly, we put in clarifications and interpretations in the past. And then we've also inserted precedent from the past. And so what we're trying to do here is bring some of these things that the legislature has followed for 30, 40 years and put those into the manual. And the thing about the manual is it really takes the process in chronological order versus the rules. On the rules, you'll have certain rules for the regular session, and then later in the package of rules, there'll be rules for the budget session. What the manual does is take everything and put it in chronological order, so it's easier to for folks to follow. And what we're doing here, these insertions are important because when the question comes up, the chief clerk will turn to the manual, and if it's in the manual and it's not in the rule, then that's what's going to govern, Mr. Chairman. And by inserting these precedents, there'll be less need for the chief clerk to talk with the attorneys, for the speaker or the president to talk to the chief clerk. It'll be black and white if you adopt some of these insertions to the manual. If you have any questions, Mr. Chairman, just ask me. What my plan would be to just skip over anything that's just a rule or a technical correction, but just really to talk about the substantive provisions, if that's okay.
Mr. Groover, and thank you for doing all this work for us. We appreciate it. Yeah, I think hopefully somebody's going to put this on the screen, right? Are we going to have the ability to put that up and roll through it, or are we not? Because if we're on computers, it's kind of hard to, I guess we could just put it up and roll through it. But if you can, that'd be good. If you can't, just let me know. And then I guess the other thing is any member of the subcommittee that has a question should go ahead, I think, and just interrupt Mr. Groover at that time that they want to talk about it. Otherwise, we're going to get too many pages along to remember where we're at. So, so I guess staff, do we have the capability to put it on the screen? If not, just let me know.
Mr. Chairman, we do have that ability. Katie's just working on it right now.
And Mr. Groover, I think, just for the sake of helping all of us, I think if you go page by page, if you just go page, this is a technical correction, but I think show them all. Don't go to skip from page 2 to page 8 if there's an amendment in there. If there's not an amendment, then skip to the next page where there is one. But I think roll through it even if it's a technical correction.
Okay, Mr. Chairman. Katie, are you ready to go? Yeah. Mr. Chairman, while they're working on that, Matt, do you want me to talk real quick about the bigger issue or bigger project right now? Well, maybe let's wait till later. Okay. All right.
And Mr. Groover or Matt, I think the other question I have is it the intent to get through this entire document today? And then will we have a subsequent meeting maybe to finalize things, or we're going to get through half of it? What's kind of the objective for the day?
Mr. Chairman, that's always dependent on the number of questions that you have. My view is you could get this done and be done somewhere around the 12 o'clock, 1 o'clock hour if you have that much time.
Gotcha.
Okay, Mr. Chairman, ready to go. Page 1, you'll see the 2022 budget session. That'll depend on when you guys actually get this done. My suggestion would be that you try to do it in the 2023 session. You have a new legislature coming in. Page 1 Well, page I, you do have an amendment, and it's one, insert the correct session, and then after rules, and there's an insertion, Mr. Chairman, to the second paragraph, not inconsistent with the Constitution. All that language does is really follow the rule and make it real clear that we're not trying to change the rules. Going on to page 1, Mr. Chairman. It's down a few, Katie. There we go. All right, on pre-filing assignment of bill numbers, Mr. Chairman, under paragraph 2, that's really just updating that to the electronic system. The substantive provision there is a limit to 15 co-sponsor requests. That was inserted when you adopted the electronic system. That's a carryover from the postcard. The 15 limit was looked at in 2000, again in 2017 by select committees. That's always a bone of contention. But at that time, management councils wanted to keep the 15. The historic reason for the 15, Mr. Chairman, is about 30 years ago, legislators got wise to the idea that if they had everybody co-sponsor the bill, it would just go through like greased lightning. And so to stop that and to stop from sending out 60 co-sponsor requests for every bill in the House, I guess now it would be 62, they adopted this 15 limitation. And there is an exception for the 15 limitation. If someone wants to go to their leadership and get approval of the leadership in their party, then the 15 limitation no longer applies.
Mr. Groover?
Yes.
A question to me would be, and I didn't see it here, but I appreciate that last piece you talked about, which is you can seek approval. That's not in here, and I think it should be in here. If that's one of the, kind of the underlying pins of this, that you can get more than 15, then we should explain how it can be done. I'm not a big fan of more than 15, period. I think that's a discussion management council ought to have, and I think this section should be flagged specifically to visit about. I think by putting a majority of signatures on there, it's kind of goes beyond where we want to go as far as ensuring that a bill has due debate and due process and is not just greased. So.
And Mr. Chairman, that last line in paragraph 2, additional procedures regarding pre-filing are found in Appendix N. And we could move that language up from Appendix N, but it is in Appendix N. And in fact, there's quite a bit more in Appendix N. I think it's a page and a half. So this hits the general rule of 15. It doesn't hit the exception, but the exception and the way to get more than 15 is found in Appendix N. If you want, we can certainly move that up to paragraph 2.
No, that's good. If it's all in there, that's great. Thanks.
Okay. All right, Mr. Chairman, the next would be at the bottom of page 1. It's just noting that you do reserve a number for the feed bill. On page 2, second paragraph, this issue comes up, incumbent legislator. And what LSO has done is follow the statute, which says that an incumbent legislator who's not coming back for the next session, LSO will draft bills for them, but the bills will not be pre-filed. And the issue is, well, what happens? Representative X sponsors the bill, and there it is sitting there, but there's no one to carry it. And so those bills aren't pre-filed, Mr. Chairman. And the explanation notes that that's different from a legislator who is in the session and maybe has to leave session for a while. Once the bill is pre-filed, that bill belongs to the body. And so they can treat it however they want to as far as moving it forward. And the insertion of this just clarifies we don't pre-file those bills, and it's really just following practice and putting practice into the manual. Mr. Chairman, on page 2, underneath the staff comment, again, following practice, and really, it's really a constitutional delegation issue, is that no committee that has, or whatever you want to call it, task force, that has non-legislators on it who vote can sponsor legislation. The legislative power belongs to the 90 or 93 people elected, and you can't delegate that to non-legislators. And again, following practice, but puts it into the manual so it's absolutely clear, because that issue does come up once in a while. Mr. Chairman, on the bottom of page 2, putting in an interpretation and again precedent, the Constitution prohibits introduction of a bill with an appropriation within the last 5 days of session. Well, you've had special sessions that don't even last 5 days and they have appropriations in it. The LSO has taken the position that that constitutional provision does not apply to special session. Again, this just puts it in the manual so it's clear. Sorry, Mr. Chairman, I have to go back to an amendment on page 1, paragraph 2. And this is for the electronic versions. And what's happened is that the LSO has adopted a procedure in which you can just verbally okay the sponsorship of the bill. And this amendment I suggest on page 2, paragraph 2, is that if the provision or the approval doesn't result in a hard copy, some kind of record, then you have to make a record of it. Mr. Chairman, it doesn't happen often, but once in a while, people will get crossways because they say, I didn't approve that bill, and bill processors say, yes, you did. You called me on such and such a day. And really, this is just a protection for legislators and the LSO to make sure we don't number it, or I shouldn't say we, the LSO doesn't number it until we have an electronic or a record of that approval. On page 3, I had an amendment suggested, and I think you can ignore that, Mr. Chairman. It's clarified in Appendix F as I went through it, and I don't think there's a need to make a change. On page 4, Mr. Chairman, the first paragraph, there's a suggested amendment. And this deals with bills that come back with, well, bills which the committee takes no action or passes a without recommendation motion. And the rules are a little bit unclear on this, Mr. Chairman. I shouldn't say unclear, they don't specify. If a bill fails or no action is taken on the bill, then the rules are real clear. Those don't get reported back until after the last day for reporting bills from committee. But when bills have a do not pass recommendation or without recommendation pass, the rules say that that's reported to the LSO, and the LSO puts it on the website so people know what happened, that the bill probably is dead. But it doesn't say when exactly the bill will be reported to the front desk. And so this puts in what the practice has been. And it's just generally they're not reported. And the difference that makes, Mr. Chairman, is if the House or the Senate wants to recall a bill from committee, they don't have to suspend the rules. All they have to do is get the required seconds. I think it's 3 in the Senate, 5 in the House, and then a simple majority vote brings it back to the floor. That's contrary to a bill in which is reported after the last day for reporting bills. To get a bill like that out, you would have to suspend the rules, Mr. Chairman. And again, all this does is put in what has been practiced, and we talked to the chief clerks just to clarify that this is exactly how it's handled in the House and Senate, and we got that clarification, and we think it's important to put into the manual as you get new chief clerks, and it'll make it easier for them and not have to call a retired chief clerk up and say, how do we handle this kind of thing, Mr. Chairman?
So, Mr. Groover, this is in that supplemental proposed amendments to this document that's on the screen, right?
Boy, I'm sorry.
Mr. Groover, can you hear me now?
Mr. Chairman, that is in the amendment. That's the page 4, first paragraph, delete entirely and insert. And Mr. Chairman, I think the way to proceed, or what I would suggest, is we walk through the whole thing, have a motion just to adopt as written, and then a motion to adopt the suggested amendments, pass those, and then have any additional amendments or motions for additional changes or amendments. I think that would be the easiest, fastest way, Mr. Chairman, but of course, that's your call.
Mr. Groover, that sounds good to me. My question is, are you going to cover those amendments as you walk through now? I assume you are. Just refer to it as, so all of us know you're going to that amendment sheet.
Yep. I'll try to be clear on that, Mr. Chairman. And I think that when I did talk about the amendment. It's basically just a clarification of what was in the manual. The next one would be substitute bills, Mr. Chairman, on page 4. And what we're doing here is really putting in precedent and practice. Substitute bills always throw people for a loop because generally a committee secretary might have won a session. And so, well, how do I do this? It's different from everything else. And the substantive change here, Mr. Chairman, is that we've allowed chairman to request a substitute bill. The manual used to say a committee can request it, but in practice, we've always allowed just chairman to come down and say, Dave, I need to do a substitute bill. And this just puts in practice how we do the substitute bill, Mr. Chairman. And again, there's an appendix which goes through the substitute bill process in more detail. Mr. Chairman, I'm on to page 5. And we do have an amendment on this page, but the first paragraph is practice and guidance for the chief clerks and for LSO. And this is a return of a committee report. And again, we're putting in practice and what's done at least 30 years or so that I worked for LSO. You'll get a committee report, it comes from the committee to the chief clerk to the attorney's office, and we've spot technical changes or problems with the committee's proposed amendments. If they're technical, then we just go ahead and do them and let the chairman know. If they're substantive, we go ahead and do them, let the chairman know, and let the chairman decide whether he thinks that they're substantive and substantial. If they're both, then our recommendation to the chairman is you can't just do this on your call. You really have 2 options here. You can take the bill back to committee and get it right, or you can just go ahead and write up the standing committee amendment as you did it, which is wrong. But then the chairman explains, vote against the standing committee amendment, adopt committee of the whole amendment number 1, which is what we meant to do. And this paragraph just puts that into the manual, Mr. Chairman. Again, it's just historic practice, and it makes it easier for LSO and chief clerks and legislators to follow down the line.
Mr. Groover, just one question here, one comment. And it says prepare a second reading amendment, but sometimes that's just a committee of the whole amendment. I've seen that as well.
Mr. Chairman, I guess I'd say this. It depends on the chairman and depends on the bill. Sometimes the chairman will just want you to vote no on the standing committee amendment and says, I'll bring a second reading amendment to clean that up tomorrow. And sometimes if they're confident that no one will get confused, they'll do it on committee of the whole. And probably what we should say is a committee of the whole or second reading amendment, because it really just depends on the circumstances and the chairman's prerogative. And so, Mr. Chairman, I just take that up right now as a kind of oral amendment, and after, this is on the last sentence of the first paragraph, and prepare a committee of the whole or second reading amendment.
Committee members, does anybody have an objection to that kind of technical correction? If not, we'll just do it. Okay, looks like we're good.
Okay, Mr. Chairman. The next paragraph is in the, there's an amendment to it. It's on page 1 of the amendments, the bottom line, or the last thing, page 5, second paragraph. And all that does, the amendment, is just to more closely follow the language of the rules. What's in the manual or proposed to be inserted in the manual is kind of a shortened version of the rules. And I think it's worth just making real clear that the manual is not changing the rules here at all. And so what the amendment does is follow the rules language. Mr. Chairman, turning on the amendments to the second page. In the staff comment, there's really a line in there that's, it says at the very end, a failed do pass motion might be followed by an adopted do not pass motion, which would result in an immediate report to the front desk. An immediate report is really not accurate. The rules really don't say when it will be to the front desk. And this is what I talked about just a little while ago. That would depend on the chairman's prerogatives and might well depend on what the floor wants to do with that. So in the staff comment, you don't have to amend it, but we should delete an immediate and just say would result in a report to the front desk. And again, the failed motion is reported to LSO. LSO puts it on the website so everybody knows that as a practical matter, the bill is likely dead. Not necessarily, but very likely. Mr. Chairman, page 5 in the middle, right after that insertion would be for all other bills. And this is where by rule, and we're just putting it into the manual so it's real clear, you report after the last day for reporting bills from committee if you've taken no action. And those are the ones that say died in committee, Mr. Chairman. I'm on to page 6, Mr. Chairman. And again, we're inserting historic practice. And this is, the Senate doesn't, is a little bit different than the House. The House is really clear that if a bill comes back with an unfavorable recommendation, a do not pass or without recommendation, that's not considered until all the bills with favorable motions are considered. And only by motion can you bring that up. A motion to suspend the rules, can you bring that up and put it on a different order because the House has a rule on it. And in the Senate, and the chief clerk's here if you have any questions for him, but I think actually Ellen made this comment and we put it in, that the Senate generally follows that, but it's up to the determination of the Senate Majority Floor Leader. So there's just a slight difference, and the manual reflects that difference. Mr. Chairman, the next line is, this comes up quite a bit, re-referred bills, appropriation recommends do not pass. Well, the recommendation of the first committee is what controls, and that's in the rule. Again, just put it in the manual because of just for clarification, and it's easier to find that way. Page 6, the addition by majority of those present, that's in the rule, but put it in the manual, just a matter of explanation. I'm on to page 7, Mr. Chairman. And this language in paragraph 11 is just the insertion of the rule that you can lay it back or you can accelerate it by suspending the rules. On second reading, Mr. Chairman, this is the middle of that paragraph 11. Rather than taking a formal vote, this is just what we do. You say it's been read 2 times, question shall be read a 3rd time. You don't have a vote. You just bang the gavel. Being no objection, so ordered. At the very bottom of paragraph 11, and this just puts in, again, doesn't change the rules. It just specifies that the Senate has a specific rule for 7-6, and the historic practice of the Senate is that you can only have procedural objections to a bill being read a 3rd time. And the House, it's been, you have the historic practice of deleting the enacting clause when you want to speak against the bill on 3rd reading. It's been tried at least 2 or 3 times, Mr. Chairman, in the House to do that on 2nd reading. Let's not even get it to 3rd. The House has consistently ruled that that's out of order. And so we put that in the manual here, Mr. Chairman. Moving to 3rd reading of the bill, Mr. Chairman, page 7. Again, this is just guidance and practice. And the practice has been, the list is compiled by majority floor leader, and it's accelerated by 1 day. Mr. Chairman, in the House, 1 person can remove from the acceleration list. But what we do here is a matter of guidance is we also, what happens is somebody comes back and says, well, geez, we have just 1 person that's objecting to this thing. How do we get around that? So they can't object to every bill and basically stop an acceleration list, Mr. Chairman. And so what you've done in the past and what we put in the manual here is that you suspend the rule along with your suspension for acceleration. So you do both at once, and that way you avoid 1 member basically doing away with the acceleration list, Mr. Chairman. I've talked about the delete the enacting clause, Mr. Chairman, and on page 8, the middle of the paragraph, it specifies how you handle that, and the House's practice has always been any bill that has a delete the enacting clause, regardless of where it is on the calendar, you move that to the bottom of the list and you take those issues up, those bills up last on 3rd reading. And again, it puts in practice, Mr. Chairman, the last sentence of that paragraph. The Senate doesn't follow a delete the enacting clause provision. The Senate just allows debate on 3rd reading, even if the bill has no amendment. And that's actually the reason behind the delete the enacting clause, Mr. Chairman, in the House. There's a rule that says there's no debate on the bill unless the bill has amendments. And so that's the amendment, and that's the practice that's been developed in the House. Mr. Chairman, I'm on to page 9. And I should say anytime, I'm going through here pretty fast. Anytime you want me to slow down or to talk about something in more detail, just let me know, Mr. Chairman. I'll go to the amendments, Mr. Chairman. I should have on page 8 in the amendments, on page 2 of the amendments, referencing page 8 of the manual, there's just an insertion of a Senate rule. All right, turning to page 9, Mr. Chairman. We put in that there are special rules for general appropriations bills. You don't allow amendments on committee of the whole for general appropriations. We put that in the manual. Again, it makes it easier because it follows a sequential process. You don't have to look in different places of the rules to find that. Senate rules provide the bodies can take no action until the amendment's been reduced to writing. This is the 2nd paragraph, Mr. Chairman. Again, we're inserting practice and precedent here, and the House has been a little bit more liberal than the Senate. If you get out on the House floor and you see that, oh, we missed this word, we should have had this word, we have the wrong page and line numbers, the House allows oral amendments, even though you have a rule that says amendments have to be reduced to writing. And the House is a little bit more liberal than that, and we put that practice in the manual. Mr. Chairman, the last sentence of the second paragraph, it's also probably a little bit more lenient in the House, just because the House is busier. You have 60 members, now 62, than the Senate. And we've allowed historically, the LSO, when I say we, has accepted, a member popping their head in and saying, hey, I want to change this. The bill's up in 2 readings. And so we don't make them write it down. We just accept that and we go from there and try to get it back to the member if we can before we put it out. And that puts that practice in the manual, Mr. Chairman. Again, just a matter of guidance for future House attorneys and legislators. Mr. Chairman, on page 9, the amendment or the paragraph that starts with amendment to a bill must be germane. This is kind of an important provision, and we're putting it in the manual because really your historic practice has differed from what Mason says. Masons would say arguments as to whether an amendment is germane, whether an amendment is within the single subject. Those really aren't points of order. Those go to the substance of a bill or the amendment and argue against the amendment and that it's changing the intent of the bill as a substantive matter, not as a point of order. You've allowed the chairman of or the speaker to make rulings on those objections, Mr. Chairman. And so we're putting in the manual that those actually can be raised as points of order. Now, the Senate has actually adopted, I think 2 or 3 years ago, a rule that does this, so you really wouldn't have to for the Senate. But this makes it clear that the House precedent has also been that those are points of order. You rule on them and you take them up as a point of order and you're done with it. You don't have to argue about the substance of it if you've already taken it up as a point of order. And generally what happens, go ahead, Mr. Chairman.
I'm sorry. Mr. Groover and Matt, on this particular point, and maybe others like this, where we have a practice that is similar, the House that is similar to a Senate rule or vice versa, maybe write those down, get those kind of down on a list. So, perhaps the House may want to take this up as a rule if it's been our practice and the Senate has a rule. So just, I think if we just had those on a list to look at some point in time, that would be good.
Mr. Chairman, we'll do that. And in fact, when we get through the end of this, Matt and I have talked about a larger project for this committee or another select committee along the lines of that very thing, to take an overview of the rules and an overview of management council practices and policies, and really take a good look at something that, as far as I know, has not been done in the history of the LSO. As we've looked at certainly individual issues along the way and even select committees, but a comprehensive look of all these things that have developed in 50 years, I think would be something well worth the LSO and the legislature's time, Mr. Chairman. And those kind of things are on that kind of list. Mr. Chairman, the staff comment explains what I just said about Masons and historic practice differing a little bit. On page 9, last paragraph, there's an amendment. On page 2, you'll see the reference is page 9, last paragraph, and that's just a pure technical thing. On page 10, Mr. Chairman, historic practice, and this has been one that you've looked at a number of times. It comes up, and I know in the last couple of sessions, the House has deviated from this, but I don't know if that's really the intent or not. I can tell you that the Select Committee in 2000 and then again in 2017 looked at this and wanted to stay with, or thought that you should stay with the limit on co-sponsors. The House has a limit of 3 co-sponsors, so 4 sponsors total for an amendment. The Senate allows 4 co-sponsors. And the reason for the Senate is so a full committee could sponsor an amendment. In the House, in the last couple of sessions, I think that sometimes it slips by, but I think there's been a time or two where they've actually gone and insisted on having more than 3, and you've allowed it. And so there's a little bit of a question of what the precedent has been, but I can tell you for 30 years anyway, it was pretty firm that it was only 3. And the reason for that, Mr. Chairman, and for the debate, is that just the workflow. You have legislator X sticks his head in and says, oh yeah, and legislator YZ is going to be on that with me. So we put Y and Z on it. It gets out on the floor, and A and B in the same delegation says, well, geez, I need to be on that too. And so now it's A and B. And so you do a corrected copy, and only to get no change substantively, only to change the sponsors. The floor is confused. It takes up time. And so that's the historic reason behind the limitation. Mr. Chairman, say, no, that's it. You get 3, and pick your 3 wisely, because we're not going to add 4 and 5 and 6. Mr. Chairman, I'm down to engrossing unless you have any questions on that.
Just a comment. I think it's really good to have that limit in there, and I think it's good to have it in the manual.
Yep.
Mr. Chair.
Mr. Chair, nope. Go ahead.
Representative Yen?
Mr. Chair, thank you. Mr. Groover, so I know that there have been several times where people put more. Is the idea to put the language of historic practice, does it purposely limit those times where people are able to go over? I mean, is there any authority required to go over, other than just being a legislator, the number of co-sponsors on an amendment?
Mr. Chairman, no, there isn't. And what you're doing here by putting it in the manual, if you look at the hierarchy, you have your Constitution in the House anyway, the Constitution, rules, and the manual is very next. Precedent is down a little bit. And so you're elevating precedent to basically just under rules by putting it in the manual. And Representative Yin, I think really what it would do, the effect of this would be to allow the chief clerk, the presiding officer, to take a harsher, a firmer stance, I shouldn't say harsher, firmer stance, to say, no, 3 is the limit. It's right there in the manual. Basically, not quite the rules, but real close to being in the rules. And by the way, I should have mentioned this. The manual is voted on by the bodies, just like the rules. And so when the presiding officer or the chief clerk says that, it's like, no, the bodies have spoken. A majority has adopted this as a rule to follow. And you can't be having exceptions every time a legislator wants an exception. If you want to do that, go ahead and suspend the rules, I suppose, for to get 4 or 5 or 6 co-sponsors on. Does that answer your question, Representative?
Representative Yen?
Mr. Chairman, I mean, I guess it gives a little more leeway to the chair, but it's still, I mean, other than saying it's historic practice, doesn't actually say it's against the rules or not proper. I mean, other than it's saying it's precedent and then codifying precedent in the manual, but also not having a way to get around it other than leaving it more ambiguous for the chair to have that power. Is that correct?
Mr. Chairman, Representative, I would say actually by putting this in the manual, you're giving less leeway to the presiding officer. The clerk would say, no, this is what your rule is, Mr. Chairman. And then the chairman would say, well, my hands are tied. That's what the rule is, Mr. Chairman. And I would mention that unlike the co-sponsor limit for bills, which does have an exception where you can go to the presiding officer in your party, there is no such exception for co-sponsors of amendments. And, you know, it's not for me to say, you guys can debate it, but I would say this from practice, especially in the past when the amendments have gone down in the last couple of years. But 10 years ago, when things were really cranking out, the last thing you want to do is to hold up your process in order to get another co-sponsor on an amendment and send out corrected copies of amendments where the floor is looking around, scratching their head saying, well, I'm looking at the two amendments. What's the change here? Well, the change is we added Representative X. That's it. Everything else is the same. And you can say that to people, but they're still going to want to look and compare the original amendment to the corrected copy amendment just to make sure that there is nothing's getting snuck by anyone here. And so it really does, this whole, let's add a co-sponsor, let's change the co-sponsor thing really can, I won't say bullocks up the thing, but it really can slow things down.
Thanks, Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Gruber and Matt, can you hear me okay?
Yeah, we can hear you okay.
Yeah, so Matt, and it's not, don't break yourself down getting it done, but I think what Mr. Gruber said was interesting, that the number of amendments has dropped off over time. Is there a way that we could get, a table of how amendments, the number of amendments per bill, you got so many amendments, so many bills, what has that looked at over time? And the reason I think it's important, and I may be wrong, and I know I'm definitely old school, and it'll change when all the gray hairs flip to Representative Yen's color hair. But I think this all electronic process dampens the amount of amendments and dampens several things. But I think understanding, just tracking that over time would be worthwhile, just to understand how things have changed.
Yep. Mr. Chairman, we'll see what we can do to get that information. And Mr. Chairman, I think I would just point out at this point in time to Representative Yen's broader question of what does including the amendment co-sponsor limit in the manual actually do? And what is the effect of that? And all these changes is, really, if you're going to deviate from these changes, if they're adopted by the House and the Senate, a member could argue to deviate from them, you really need to suspend Rule 1.2 in the House and Senate, because that rule provides that the manual governs all parliamentary practice and procedure before the Senate and the House respectively. So if you want to try to add more co-sponsors, then what it's going to say in the manual now, you would actually need to suspend that rule to do so.
Mr. Chairman. So, Mr. Chairman.
Go ahead,
Maybe
Representative.
just so for the committee's thought process, basically the thing I'm thinking of specifically is appropriations, and appropriations often has amendments where they put the whole committee's name on it, regardless of what the historic practice has been. So whether or not that's something we do or do not want to allow, I guess that's for the committee, subcommittee, and ultimately the bodies to decide.
So Representative Yen, I think if we approve this and then that's done, then a member of the body could say, hey, they could challenge that. And then we'd have to go through the process of looking in this book and then ultimately deciding if we want to suspend the rule to allow that. I think it's good that we're putting it in here, though. Please proceed.
Mr. Chairman, this is Chris.
Go ahead, Senator.
Thank you. Following up on Representative Yen, some of the things make sense as rules where they effectively become a rule. Anything we put in here is equivalent to a rule, so it is rule-like. But, when we first had this discussion on Management Council, some of the things that I was concerned about were those that were codifying what was effectively tradition or soft tradition, where even though that has standing, elevating it to a rule does require a suspension. So that requires effectively a 2/3 vote instead of an interpretation override, which is what I would expect a custom or standard historic practice to take, where everybody understands that that is theoretically binding, but the moment they overrule it, you sort of strike that, and now you've got what is effectively a new tradition. And I'm a little sensitive to doing that, as well as, I look at language just as an example. This is back a few pages, but on page 6, where it says, as a matter of historic practice, throughout the session, the Senate generally considers bills with favorable committee recommendations prior to bills with unfavorable recommendations. But this is subject to determination by the Senate Majority Floor Leader in determining the order of bills to be considered on general file. To me, something like that, which is true, doesn't have any, there's nothing bound there. It basically says, yeah, we could do that, but if the majority leader doesn't want to do that, then we won't do that. Those are the, what does that mean to have a 2/3 vote to override it? I mean, to me, some of these things where we're codifying historic practice, I just don't know why we would do that, or what's broken about the system as it is right now, where that's in the bin of historic practice instead of legislative manual. Some of the other ones, like we were just talking about with regard to, let's try and limit the number of co-sponsors on a bill, or amendment, or the timing of that, which gets to workflow without suspension. I think that's important, but this is the concern I have with a lot of the changes. And I just following on Representative Yin, I wanted to voice that now, and I don't know if others share that concern, but I thought it was a good time to raise that. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Gruber, I guess, and Matt, note that that comment of Senator Rothfuss on whether historic practice should be overruled by a majority or in fact a suspension of the rules, and then we'll just keep that in our little chest as we go forward.
And Mr. Chairman, I think the senator brings up a really good point for you all to consider moving forward, is how you want to treat that. And I can just tell you this, why we've done that is twofold. One, the lack or the loss of institutional knowledge that we've suffered over the last 5 to 10 years on both the staff and the legislator side. So creating one central repository for that information. And also, to the senator's point, we have in the past attempted to put this kind of information in other documents, like the legislative handbook or the management council handbook. The problem is with that approach, we found, and the co-sponsor, the amendment co-sponsor is a perfect example, is staff and legislators don't know to look in the legislative handbook for those, for where the amendment co-sponsor is listed. So we let inadvertently sometimes those things slip. And so that's the reason for putting it all in one place in the manual. But you've got that concern that then it elevates it to essentially a quasi-rule of the bodies.
Mr. Chairman, quick follow-up, if I may.
Senator Rothfuss, please.
Thank you. Well, along those lines, I think there's almost a simple way to do it, but it would be, I guess, a substantial policy change. If we don't elevate these to rule equivalent, even though we can adopt them and point to them, if the will of the body is always sufficient to go a different direction from this as a guidance document. In other words, this is the default position, but if the will of the body is by a vote of the majority at any given moment takes us in a different direction, that's perfectly reasonable. That basically means that, the moment the body wants to change its mind and doesn't like one of these approaches, it gets to do that without having to get to a 2/3 majority rule change. and has it at a different level of standing, which I honestly once thought it was, right? I had naively thought that the manual was more the recommendations and this is how we do things, but wasn't of the standing of rules. And really only a few years ago learned that it had the standing of rules. I'm not entirely sure all of the members understand that it has the standing of rules. And so I guess the question is, should it, or should and this would be easy from a change of language standpoint, should this be able to be overridden by a simple majority of the body, whereas the rules would still require a 2/3 majority to suspend or change?
I think that's a great debate, Senator, and how we want to go down that. The question I'd have to Dave or Matt, in the House, I can't remember there ever being, I remember lots of rules meetings, historic practice coming up, there being a ruling by the presiding officer. And then that has been probably challenged occasionally, Matt, if you can, or Dave, if you can remember. And how have we traditionally handled that as far as the House? I don't recall us ever overthrowing historic practice on the floor once a presiding officer ruled on historic practice. So I guess the question is, how has that been handled?
Mr. Chairman, that would simply be for someone to challenge the ruling from the presiding officer. And there's a provision in your rules to do that. I can't remember whether it's been historic practice. I think there probably have been one or two where it has been. Said this is how we've done things before in the past, and folks have moved to challenge that ruling of the presiding officer. They certainly have on certain rulings, and I think one or two may have been based on precedent, Mr. Chairman. The bottom line is a majority can undo anything. Even your rule that you need a 2/3 vote to suspend the rules can be undone by a majority. And the motion would be to suspend that rule that requires that, and to suspend the rule that requires a 2/3 vote to do that. The majority always rules at the end of the day. Now, does that work, Mr. Chairman? A lot of times it doesn't, because the argument is, well, once we start going down that road, then everything's up to a majority vote, and every decision we make is a majority vote, and that would really bollocks up the whole thing. We'd never get anything done. So it's not often an argument that wins the day, but at the end of the day, it does. More directly to your point, I don't recall anyone ever, a presiding officer, making a determination based on the manual of legislative procedures and then putting to a vote whether that is a rule or whether it's not a rule. I think if someone were to ask me, I would say it's not a rule. It's procedural authority right underneath the rules, and you're bound by it. Same way that you're bound by precedent, which in the House is right underneath the manual legislative procedures, but it's not a rule. And I don't think it would take a 2/3 vote to overrule something that the manual says. But honestly, I don't remember that ever coming up. And Matt might well disagree with me on that. You would have to take a 2/3 vote to overrule the rule that Matt talked about that sets out your historic or your hierarchy of procedural statements, but you're really not overruling your hierarchy. You're just overruling a statement within one of those places, this one being the manual.
So I think we've highlighted a very interesting point, and I think we just capture that. And then we have that debate later on down the road when we bring it to Management Council, how we want to handle that. And I guess Senator Rothfuss.
Thanks. I think it's kind of essential though, because and it gets to the core of what we're doing. I'm incredibly comfortable putting things into this manual of procedure as this is the historic practice. This is the way we've traditionally done things. All of those kinds of concepts, which is what we have drafted here. If it goes like Mr. Groover just said, which is that we can override that, not say it's wrong, which is different, right? But actually just override it with a majority because this has some lower standing. But putting all of these things in and then treating them as explicit rules requiring a 2/3 override, which is what I take from Director Obrecht and in previous conversations that I've had with them where I've challenged some of these things and then never taken them to the floor because I expected a 2/3 override to be needed in the past when I looked into things like this. I'm less comfortable putting in language that isn't what I would contemplate as perfect. So I don't know that this is a discussion, honestly, for, well, we can settle this down the road, because I don't know how much I like of all of the red text if it's going to take a 2/3 to override it. So I think it's something that maybe we do need to contemplate. Do we want to go with the interpretation that Mr. Groover just said, or the interpretation of the hardline 2/3? That's kind of the first thought I think we have to contemplate and potentially resolve. The second is a nuance as we contemplate this. There's the idea that you can just override with a majority. So you get an appeal to the chair of a decision of the chair, and then that can be overridden by a majority of the body, and then you go the alternative direction. That is fair, but what that means is if the chair were to be ruling based on a matter of fact, this does not comply with, or this is against the rules, which is what they should do. In other words, they shouldn't be ruling what they want. They should be ruling what is appropriate based on the rules, and what they want should not be a part of the discussion. And then we would be forcing the body to basically shift to a override based on what they want if a 2/3 is required. And that, to me, seems to, as Mr. Groover said, take us to a point where we devolve appropriate debate and keep a separation between rules and desires, where the desires are hopefully debatable. But I would like to think we would agree on what the rules actually say, even though we don't always. Most of the times when things are healthy, we do. So I think it's really important that we know which direction this committee wants to go and what we would want to take as a recommendation to Management Council, because for me, it changes everything about what we would put together as appropriate, as an appropriate manual.
So Senator Rothfuss, I agree, only we don't have a motion on the floor. So by setting it aside, I meant to that point in time where we make a motion on this draft and then we can make that decision. So yeah, I didn't mean forever. I mean just for now, because we're just going through a review process. And did Senator Landon get his sound, Co-Chair Landon get his sound on or not? Doesn't appear to be. So Rep Yan, I'm going to make you acting chairman for the moment while I step away. And Mr. Groover, please continue.
Okay, Mr. Chairman, I'm back on page 10, paragraph 15, engrossing. This is precedent, and it can be important. Basically, your rules say that once a bill leaves possession of the House, that House can't act on it unless it makes a motion to recall the bill. The question is, what happens with bills that are in the possession of the LSO getting engrossed? We've allowed historically purely technical corrections. Bill processing comes to me as House Attorney and says, hey, we found out this amendment is really wrong here. You need it to say House instead of Senate, et cetera. We'll make a technical correction, put that out as a corrected copy of the amendment without requiring the House to actually recall the bill. Other than that, once the bill goes into the possession of the LSO for engrossing, it has left the possession of whatever House acted on it first. And it can't be recalled by that House without them making the formal motion to do that. Mr. Chairman, on page 11, and the conference committee action, newly inserted language, this is guidance and it's practice, and it goes to the authority of the JCC. And we put in a couple of examples. If you don't agree with them, certainly you would want to take them out. But the first question that rises up, well, what happens if the first House doesn't do anything on an issue? The second House puts in an appropriation. Is, say for $1,000, is an appropriation for $500 within the JCC's authority? And at one point, the hard line was, well, no, that's not between the two because the first one didn't have anything to do with an appropriation. I can tell you at least 20 years ago or so, we adopted the position that no, anything between 0, which is what the first House did, and 1,000 is between the two. Then the second example is, well, what happens if you have an appropriation with conditions? Yeah, appropriation without any conditions, probably in between the two. And an appropriation where you change conditions, we've given the guidance in the past that really goes beyond between the two. And this is kind of akin to an amendment to an amendment to an amendment. At some point, you get so far that it's unfair to the first House to say they never thought about an appropriation, they never thought about conditions, they certainly didn't think about modifications of conditions, and neither House really thought about that. And so that's the examples that we put in here. You can go between the two, between having no action and $1,000 lies any number in between that. Again, it's precedent, it's guidance, and that's what's been done in the past. If you don't think it should be in there, obviously you want to make a motion to take it out when you act on the whole manual. Page 12, Mr. Chairman, receding from non-concurrence.
Mr. Chairman?
That's just a statement.
Mr. Gruber, sorry. Senator Rothfuss.
Absolutely.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. One thing that has come up in the past, though, is the inability, particularly for Appropriations Committee, but even for Conference Committee actions, to have an appropriate path or remedy for appeal to the germaneness is not, that's not appropriate. The appropriateness will say of an amendment from a conference committee as it's being presented to the body. How would someone challenge that and say, you had your $0, you had your $1,000, and the conference committee came back with $2,000. So even though we have this here, they can agree to it, bring it back to the body. There doesn't seem to be a procedural challenge for that. The only challenge I'm aware of would be to vote no to the entirety of the conference committee report. So this is an interesting point, but I guess what would the remedy or challenge be? If we have it under rules, it would be nice if there were a way to have access to a challenge for that, or would we only anticipate this being challenged within the conference committee and subject to rules at the point of the conference committee action negotiation, and then once it got back to the chamber, it would only be voted up or voted down.
Mr. Groover, if you have an opinion on that, please, and then I'll return the chair to Representative Summers.
Okay, Mr. Chairman, Masons talks about that, and you can object to the conference committee going beyond its authority. I can tell you as a matter of practice, Senator, it really is, you voted up, voted down, you make your argument that they've gone beyond their authority, and you could raise a point of order on that, Mr. Chairman. I don't know of any ruling on a conference committee going beyond its authority, at least in the House. I'm not that experienced with the Senate. And it really is just an argument, just as you say, reject the conference committee report for that reason. But you could go through Masons, and Masons does have provisions to object to for going beyond its authority, but I just have never seen them do that in the House.
Mr. Chairman, a quick follow-up then. So if I were to object to it, instead of simply arguing against it, I say point of order, this conference committee report does not fall within the parameters of being between the two House positions, or excuse me, the two chamber positions. I object to it in accordance with the rule, the Mason, and now if we had this, and then you would have a ruling with the chair, from the chair, take it to the Rules Committee, et cetera. What if it were ruled to be out of order?
Go ahead, Mr. Gruber.
Mr. Chairman, I think the, and I'd have to look at Masons, but I'm pretty sure that this is correct. The presiding officer would then discharge the committee and would have the choice to appoint a new committee or not appoint a new committee.
Sounds perfect. Thank you.
Please continue.
Mr. Chairman, I'm on to page 12. And the first paragraph, proceeding for non-concurrence, that is in your joint rule. It's again put in the manual just because it's easier to follow instead of having to chase around between your joint rules and House and Senate rules looking for it. On the second paragraph, this is, your precedent really deviates from Masons here. And your rules specifically exempt the part of Masons. You'll see in the middle of there, Masons 766, paragraph 7, 6, and 7 are explicitly stated not to be applicable to conference committees. And honestly, Masons provides in 766, 767, and 768 for this process of going back and forth between the houses and accepting and rejecting changes. The Wyoming legislature has never done that. And it has never allowed a house, the first house passes an amendment, the second house does their amendments, they send it to the conference committee. Masons envisions a procedure where the first house can say, forget it, we don't want our amendments, just pass the bill as it came out of the second house without our amendments. You've never done that. The Wyoming legislature has always taken the position that that bill is not in possession of the House, of the first house. It left the second house, they put it in the conference committee. And so you can't do that. And this provision here makes that explicit. And then honestly, and it really overrules or makes inapplicable Mason 767 and 768. Mr. Chairman, on page 12, second paragraph, there's an amendment there. If you go to page 2 of your amendment list, and it says just what I say. It really makes it specific that 767, 768 aren't applicable. And again, that follows precedent. When folks say, hey, can we do this? We've always said, no, you've ruled that you don't have possession of the bill. The first house can't take out amendments they put on once it's gone to the second house. Page 12, Mr. Chairman, bills presented to the governor. The new language, there are 2 insertions here, which again follow your precedent. And that's the only place I know that you'll find them. other than the AG opinion. The first one is, we've taken the position that if you've not adjourned sine die, the chief clerk can stay there, and if the chief clerk is there to accept the veto from the governor has to get the veto back within the 3 days. And I don't know of a governor that's ever pressed that issue. They've always returned it to the chief clerk, and we've had situations where the chief clerk has accepted it within the 3 days. The second issue is the last sentence, and this is subject to an AG opinion where the Attorney General has ruled that the 3 days is 3 full 24-hour periods. So he might have, 3 days and 23 hours, actually. And all this says is that the legislature has not challenged that position. You could, again, getting back to your issue, Senator Rothfuss, you could say, well, what's that really add? Well, it just adds guidance to say that's what you've done. It doesn't say you can't do it. But it lets folks know that that's really, they don't have to know there's an AG opinion out there that says that. It's in your manual, that he has 3 full 24-hour periods. Mr. Chairman, I'm all the way to page 15 now. And those insertions are just clarifications. You voted with the side that prevailed if you want to make a motion to reconsider, and that you have to do it before the result is announced. Again, both of those are clear practice. I don't think anyone debates either of those. On page 16, we just put in the reference to the Senate rule. You can't withdraw a motion to reconsider without leave of the Senate. The House doesn't have that rule. Mr. Chairman, on page 16, paragraph 4, all we're doing there is, for some reason, and whoever wrote this at some time, maybe it was me, thought that that language that's stricken was necessary to put in there, but that's really just a little small part of those rules that we suggest inserting, 10.3, 10.1, et cetera, and the exceptions, rather than trying to repeat the whole thing here, and rather than just taking an excerpt, and so that folks don't think, well, that's everything that we have to say about that issue. It's like, no, look at your rules, you have a lot more to say about it. Mr. Chairman, I'm through to page 18. And this is kind of an important thing, and Matt might want to talk to it because it really came up under his tenure in the last couple of years. And the question is, when you adopt the joint rules, you have a provision when you first start that says that the rules of the last legislature are going to govern the new legislature until you adopt new rules. And the question is, well, now that we want to change those rules, do we need a majority vote or 2/3 vote? And the LSO took the position is that you need only a majority vote because that body, that new legislature, has never adopted that rule that said you'll adopt the preceding legislature's rules to govern until you change them. And so since you've never adopted that, you shouldn't require a 2/3 vote to change those previous rules. And that issue did come up, I think, 2 or 3 years ago, and we worked on it, and that was a position the LSO took. And so now we're putting it in the manual again, so that people are guided and say, well, we don't need a 2/3 vote. We never voted on that. We can change those rules, joint rules, with just a simple majority vote. On to the appendices, Mr. Chairman, and if you ever want to take a break, let me know. I'll be glad to.
Dave.
Mr. Gruber, if you need a break or anybody needs a break, holler, and committee members, let me know. We can take a break if anybody wants it. Thank you.
This is Chris real quick. I have a question on the adoption of joint rules.
Senator Rothfuss.
Thank you. So we had this come up, and this is how it played out based on the way the rules were structured at the time. But I remember as it was playing out, it might not have been the most elegant approach to how a non-concurrent change to the joint rules would take place. So we're codifying through the manual the way we interpreted it as it was taking place. And I guess the question maybe that we could recommend or provide a recommendation is that we revisit the rule related to a change to joint rules and require concurrence between the two chambers or nullification of the joint rule. I mean, that's certainly an opportunity. So is that something we need to contemplate as we're working this? I mean, I certainly don't object to us codifying the way it is right now, but is that something that we might want to raise to the management council, is the possibility of changing the approach to an amendment to the joint rules?
So Senator Rothfuss, I guess we can have that discussion at the time we take this up.
Okay.
Just, I guess, note to staff to note that particular place. So when we make that motion, we can come back and have that debate on that particular issue.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Please proceed.
Okay, Mr. Chairman. I'm on page 18. And this just makes it, I think, a little clearer that majority of those present as required to sustain an appeal from the ruling of the chair. We talked about that a little earlier. Oh, sorry, we talked about joint rules. Went back a little bit on you. On Appendix A, there's just insertion of physically, just a clarification. A2 on paragraph 7, that's just a clarification. Only bills with the committee amendments does the clerk send to the attorneys. If it has no amendments, the clerk just keeps that. On paragraph 8, it's just clarification on which chairman you're talking about, whether it's chairman of the standing committee or chairman of the committee of the whole, and who says what and who does what. Mr. Chairman, I think those are all the same changes all the way on Appendix B until we get to B3. And this, Mr. Chairman, issue has come up in the past, and the House has done it, and the Senate really has a rule that I think prohibits this from being done. It handles the issue a little differently. And the question is, committee of the whole report. So you go through committee of the whole, you've adopted or favorably recommended 10 bills. Someone comes and says, hey, I really didn't like the result on bill number 9. How do I get us to not adopt that? And our recommendation was you move to divide the committee of the whole report, Mr. Chairman, and the House has handled it that way. The Senate has not, as far as I know, and Ellen's here and she can correct me if I'm wrong, but I think that would be inconsistent with the Senate Rule 1210A, which says if you want to reconsider an action committee of the whole, you have to do it before you entertain a motion to adopt the committee of the whole report. And so that gets that really, because that's really what you're doing. You're reconsidering your action on that bill number 9. And the Senate says you have to do that before you consider the committee of the whole report. The House has allowed you to divide the committee of the whole report. And again, that's one of those situations, Mr. Chairman. If you're talking about recommendations to the Management Council, you might recommend that they look at the Senate rule and see if they want to adopt that in the House. Because I can tell you this, it gets a little bit sloppy in the House when you divide a committee of the whole report, but you have done it.
Mr. Gruber, we have done it, and I agree. It's probably, put it on the list of, Management Council won't do anything with it, but certainly it's something the House ought to consider. The House Rules Committee should consider that. So I think do highlight that, Matt, if you would, please.
And I'll just note and see if my Senate colleagues agree, Mr. Chairman, if I may, that the way this is phrased, the Senate has not entertained a motion to divide a committee of the whole report, appears to me to not bind the Senate in any way beyond what its current rules say, and that's how I think it probably should be. Is not authoritative, just noting that we don't have that precedent, but that doesn't deny an opportunity for that motion if somebody were to make it, and then see how it all shakes out. And I think that's the intent. So, Mr. Gruber, is that a fair interpretation of the way that that's written?
Mr. Chairman, it is. I think the result would be, the ruling would be you have to do it under Rule 1210A, but you're correct, Senator, and that it does allow you to, latitude to make that motion and see how it shakes out, as you say.
Mr. Gruber, one thing here, and I'd be interested in what my Senate colleagues think, but perhaps you should cite that rule here. So it's obviously it's in rule, but you cite a lot of other rules in this document, and you might want to cite that Senate rule here. I don't know.
Mr. Chairman, that'd be a call for this subcommittee, and I can tell you this, in my way of interpreting, if you cite the Senate rule, that kind of is a real strong indication that Senate rule controls, and that a motion to divide the report would be out of order.
And Mr. Chairman, that's precisely what I didn't want, because we haven't set that precedent. And I don't think it's appropriate for us through the manual of procedures to establish a precedent that that's true. We haven't done it at any point in my 12 years. Senator Lannon goes back further. I don't know that he's seen it. I don't think he has. And I don't think it's appropriate for us to make that decision, because that's effectively rulemaking as opposed to trying to put into the manual practices of the past.
Mr. Chairman, I hope you can hear me, and my apologies for having technical difficulties throughout the morning. But I agree with Senator Rothfuss. I think better left alone. And in this particular recommendation, I think keeping it lower on the radar screen is probably a good way to go anyway. I agree with you, Representative Summers. I think, dividing a committee, the whole report, I think that probably has gotten sloppy. So
Senator Lannon, it certainly become more common once that lid was opened. We've seen it not several times, but multiple times. And I think it's odd though, if the House were to look at that rule, then that would become a rule which would suggest that we do not want to follow the old practice. So I guess I understand the Senate's wanting to leave that open, but do you really want to have a new practice that overrules a rule? I don't think it can. Obviously, if nobody cites it, nobody objects, then it can go through, and then you end up with the same problem we have. I don't know. Senator Rothfuss.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And I don't disagree with any of that. It's just that we haven't had that debate, and we haven't created an explicit rule. And I don't feel like that's our task to determine rules for the Senate. We could clarify through rule, and that would require passing a new rule within the Senate or amending our previous rule. And we could go either way with it. But to the extent that right now there is no precedent, that's the only concern I have, is let's not try and put our thumb on the scale on either side of it and leave it up to the Senate. This is the manual of procedures. I don't think if we wanted to bring a rule change, we can do that through the rules process, and we did it last year for a good interpretation. I think there's probably a few more rules we need to bring this year, so it's certainly something that we could do. I don't think this is the place for it, particularly due to the length. I don't want us to create a contentious document that people say, "Oh, you're making rules here." I really think that's outside our scope. I could be wrong.
Please proceed.
Okay, Mr. Chairman, I'm on Appendix B3, Paragraph 15. It's a new one, and what we're doing here really is interpreting what your rules provide, and that the ayes and noes shall only be taken when a motion for passage has failed. And we note there that that in effect prohibits the calling for ayes and noes at any other time during committee of the whole. And I
Mr.
think
Chairman, on that,
Senator Rothfuss.
thank you. Mr. Groover, it's implied but not explicit that a reconsideration vote would be okay, but the call for the reconsideration itself requires ayes and noes, and that's not technically a voice vote on the failure. So should we be explicit in the fact or in the clarity that that first vote in the reconsideration is also acceptable pursuant to rule?
Go ahead.
Mr. Gruber.
Honestly, Senator, you've lost me.
Okay.
Which is easy to do right now.
No worries. Mr. Chairman, Mr. Groover, just with regard to a reconsideration vote, which if we kill the bill, which was by roll call, I can then within the same committee of the whole call for reconsideration. That reconsideration vote is not a final action vote, but it is a vote by ayes and noes. It's a roll call vote. This would tend to imply that you can't have ayes and noes on that reconsideration vote. But obviously that's an essential part of the reconsideration vote is the first half of the vote. I think the second half of the reconsideration vote, should the first half be successful, I believe that's already covered by the language. In other words, that's the actual reconsideration itself, but not the motion to reconsider. So I would suggest that you might need a reference to allow the reconsideration vote pursuant to rule as well, and have the appropriate House and Senate rules above. That's what I'm getting at. Was that clear, hopefully, Mr. Groover?
Mr. Chairman, that's 100% clear. And I think correct. That there should be an exception noting that reconsideration obviously requires ayes and noes. So, yeah.
Yep. No, that's the way we've always done it.
Mr. Chairman,
Representative Yen.
are there any other votes in committee of the whole where that might be necessary? So maybe just the broad language of prohibits the call for ayes and noes at any other time might need to be rewritten.
Mr. Chairman,
Go ahead.
none that I know of, but I miss thinking of the reconsideration vote. So there might be, but I don't know of any. And I know that the reason you don't want the ayes and noes is because then, I mean, you're acting in committee, and you could really slow things down if you had a legislator who that was their goal.
Okay, please proceed.
I'm on to Appendix C, Mr. Chairman. On C1, that's just simply, again, showing precedent, and members are requested not to vote no on the whole consent list. And I don't think I've ever seen a time where anyone has voted no on the entire consent list, Mr. Chairman. And again, I used sloppy earlier and probably shouldn't. What I really mean by sloppy, and this would be the same situation, it's very difficult for the public to see exactly what's going on if someone were to vote no on the whole consent list. And what's that mean? And so we'd have to have or LSO would have to have a new procedure to show a no vote on every one of those, I guess.
Mr. Chairman, just
Senator Rothfuss.
as a note of tradition, a number of senators have voted no on the consent list for third reading rather frequently.
Mr. Chairman, that's actually come about. It's more commonplace in the last 3 or 4 years that we have seen, but Senator Rothfuss is right. We often do get that, and then they will change their votes from no to aye on a handful of the bills on the consent list.
And in the Senator Landon, in the Mr. Co-Chair in the House, usually the chief
Okay. Oh,
clerk
that's right.
talks them out of that. So they
Okay.
out of going to a no, and they go to an aye. But yeah,
Okay.
that's interesting. If we may have to. So I guess take note of that, and I guess all it says here is members are requested not to vote no. That doesn't mean that they can't.
Yeah, and Mr. Chairman, honestly, it isn't as if it has slowed things down. It tends to be a circumstance where that member is going to vote no more often than they're going to vote aye, and they actually end up saving time. It's just that they're rather contrary.
Please proceed.
Okay, Mr. Chairman. Matt, if you want to go back just a little bit on the reconsideration, you want to talk about it, Matt, or just keep going?
Yeah, Mr. Chairman, we can talk about it quickly, but just so everyone's clear, a motion to reconsider in committee of the whole is not in order in the House. Pursuant to House Rule, I think it's 1210G. So that's really the whole reason for the divided committee of the whole report precedence in the House and why it's not necessary in the Senate. The Senate has another mechanism in which to get there where the motion to reconsider. So if we put that reference in, we just need to make sure we make it clear that that's only to motions to reconsider in the Senate in committee of the whole and not in the House. But just for, maybe some education and clarity on when you have to explain this to the rules committees.
I didn't know that. Thank you.
Okay. Proceed.
Okay, Mr. Chairman, I'm on the page D1. And in the first, paragraph 3, we have an amendment on page 2. And this is conference committee report, how things are put together. And what this amendment does is actually just put in chronological order what you have in front of you in the proposed manual. And it really is an enrolled bill in conference committee and what we do with that. And really the bottom line is LSO will enroll a bill in conference committee on a complex bill at the request of the chairman, just if it's easier to make it easier for the committee to follow and read the whole thing in context. LSO does not put that on the website. It's not an official publication of changes to the bill. The committee hasn't even adopted yet. But we will do it at the request only of a chairman. And really putting it in the manual, I think, helps a little bit in protecting the LSO, because you get to the point where every conference committee wants their amendments enrolled into a bill, and you're at the end of session and you really just don't have the time and the staff to do that. So on complex bills it will, and the other thing is it's not on the website because everybody wants it on the website so they can read it too. And the problem with putting it on the website, Mr. Chairman, is all the lines and pages have changed, and so all the amendments don't make sense. And when the lobbyists come running in with amendments, 2 hours before you're trying to get out of here, and they have page and line numbers to a document that really doesn't even exist, it just makes it very complicated. And so that's the reason for putting it into the manual, Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Chairman, just a quick question to Mr. Gruber, if I might. So I wonder if you pondered even stronger language in this amendment that we're looking at. and we could certainly consider that. We could tighten it down even further and almost to the point of exceptions may be made if the chairman genuflects in the right way or takes the staff out to lunch. Because I agree, Mr. Gruber, at that point in time, boy, you hope this is limited to just the really complex bills. And maybe that complex bill phrase is good enough, but committee, we could figure out a way to tighten that down even further.
So Senator Landon, the only other thing I can just think of off the top of my head is upon approval of the presiding officer. So the JCC chairman would have to go to the presiding officer. But, I would assume that LSO will tell, JCC chairman that, we don't have time for this. But I don't know. Mr. Gruber, you got any thoughts? Matt?
Mr. Chairman, I'll defer to Matt as to the most recent, but I can tell you in my time at LSO, it's not been a problem with the chairman. LSO will just say, we just can't do that. And I can't think of a chairman who's really pushed back on that very much. Of course, they make the initial request, but when we say no, I've never had a chairman, I don't think, push back. It's really more of an issue of, for the public and lobbyists, why they can't get it done. And, honestly, at that point in the session, it's like, too bad. We're dealing with the chairman. If you want to put that in here, you certainly can, but I can just tell you, my experience is we never had an issue with the chairman pushing back on it. I'll defer to Matt.
Mr. Chairman, we have, in my time as director in the last 6 years, we haven't had that issue. We have enrolled all of the bills in the special sessions because we've had staff capacity to do so, and that has been popular. The governor's office has asked us for those, but that has not bled over into the general or budget session. Where the true growth is and where we have had issues is on the substitute bill requests. Those are also difficult for the public to track. And difficult for staff to be able to come up with or keep up with the other workloads. That could be an area in the future where if we wanted to try to tighten that down and put more parameters on it that we would look at rather than the enrolling, just purely from a staff resource perspective.
Sounds good. I think sounds like Senator Landon, we're probably okay with the way it is, maybe, eh?
Yeah, I think so, Mr. Chairman. I think we're okay there. It sounds like staff has been able to work with the chairman of these conference committees and be fine. So thank you.
Perfect. Please proceed.
Okay, Mr. Chairman, I'm on D1F. And this is we're putting it in here because of a really unique situation. You can see that we're amending the manual. And generally, we tell conference committees, you can't adopt part of an amendment, everything except for whatever in Senate Committee of the Whole Amendment number 1. What we always advise is you delete the whole thing and then further amend. Well, you have had occasion where you might have a 10-page amendment and you just want to drop the not out of there. Well, rather than doing that, replicating that entire 10-page amendment, we have, and I'm talking a handful of situations, say, okay, adopt Senate Amendment, whatever, and in Senate Amendment Committee of the Whole Amendment number 1, subparagraph C, delete and insert, and then we'll do the insertion or deletion of the word not in there. It's just all we're trying to do is catch that really rare circumstance. And I mean, it happens once every maybe 3 sessions or 2 sessions.
Please proceed.
Mr. Chairman, I'm on to E2. And we had this discussion earlier. We put it in the motion to amend, and this is whether an amendment is germane. The Constitution only allows a single subject, and we put in the reference to the Senate Rule 11.6. We had that discussion earlier. Masons would say, this is not a point of order. That's not how the Wyoming legislature has taken it. And anyway, we put that issue in the appendix on motion to amend. That takes me to F2, Mr. Chairman. Oh, I'm sorry. On E3, on the amendments, just a couple of technical things on E1 and E3. Correct rule reference on the first one, and then a reference to the Wyoming Constitution on the second. Okay, now on the F2, Mr. Chairman. And this is where we talk about what Matt and I just talked about the Senate having a motion to reconsider provision in rule, which the House does not, and the House doesn't allow reconsideration in committee of the whole. On F3, we have an amendment, Mr. Chairman.
So, Matt, obviously, I think you've marked this, but I think this issue here, the House needs to, we just need a note to self on the House side anyway, that we need to take a look at this in House rules. Do we want to go down the path of the Senate, where you can do a reconsideration, or do we go with our precedents, or do we want to have neither, So I think that's something, just please put a note down. Please proceed.
Okay, Mr. Chairman, F3, this is a new addition suggested for the manual, and it really is just, it's not like this motion couldn't be made with or without inserting it into the manual, but it has happened, so we put it in. Again, it's quick reference for the members. We have an amendment on page 2 of the amendments, and really, all the amendment does is more fully set forth the rule rather than putting the rule in an abbreviated form. And really, it's just a recitation of the rule for the purpose, and the limitations can't be made in committee of the whole. And you have to make it when you're actually in the full legislative bodies in session. F3, motion for late introduction of the bill, same exact thing. This is for the budget session versus the general session. You have an amendment on page 3 of your amendments. It's the same thing. Instead of an abbreviated version of the rule, it really just spells out the rule and completely. F3, the very last one, we should have a section. This is a Jcc correction, motion for Jcc correction. Same thing, Mr. Chairman, not like you can't do it without putting it in the manual. Put it in the manual just like the other most common rules to give you guidance. And that's the correction, adoption of erroneous joint conference committee report without expunging the record. We've had that issue come up. And this makes it clear that you don't have to go through the process of expunging the record, which really gets complicated. And this is when you just adopted a JCC report somewhere along the line, it was incorrect. Mr. Chairman, on H2, and you have this in the rules, but it's not in the manual, and it should be. You do have a provision for when you will accept reports from select committees, and that's in number 9, and then we just go on and renumber after that. Likewise, Mr. Chairman, on H3, you have rules in the Senate, and the House doesn't have a rule, but there is a statute on it, and this is action on administrative rule orders. This happens, once in a blue moon kind of thing. But Management Council does review administrative rules, and once in a while, 99 times out of 100, if management council says they reject the rule, the governor goes along with that. And that 100th time, management council rejects a rule, governor doesn't go along with that, and management council feels strongly about it, you introduce an order of the legislature prohibiting the implementation of the agency rule. I think it's happened 2 or 3 times in the legislature's existence since the adoption of the APA. And this just puts out a procedure of when you do it and when you actually take up the joint order. Mr. Chairman, H3, we just put in the rules of when you'll take up the signing of enrolled acts. And there's a little bit of difference in the House, but with the Senate rule and the joint rule, but both houses follow the joint rule as a matter of practice. Basically, Mr. Chairman, first order of business. On I1, Mr. Chairman. And we just add that for those motions that require unanimous consent, when you sponsor a bill for an appropriation of money within the last 5 days of the close of a general budget session, you need unanimous consent. That's a constitutional provision. A 2/3 vote required. And this is under 2I. This goes back to what I talked about earlier. Do you have to have a 2/3 vote to suspend a joint rule of the previous legislature? And we've taken, that's not an adoption of a joint rule. It doesn't require a 2/3 vote. The current legislature has never taken action on it. And so you can't bind, or you shouldn't bind them to a 2/3 vote, because now, a will of the minority is superseding the will of the majority. Majority vote, Mr. Chairman, I1 carrying over to I2. We just put in a majority votes required to adopt the joint rules for H and I. Again, it's not like you don't need it if it's not in here, but we're listing all those things that require typical motions that require certain votes, and those seem like they should be listed, Mr. Chairman. I'm on to J1, Mr. Chairman. We just delete the language because it just seemed gratuitous as a statement. It doesn't really add anything. The substantive change, Mr. Chairman, is on J2. Divided amendments are always corrected copy amendments because it's changed from the initial amendment. You've either deleted part and a failed part or adopted part. I'll just skip that. Mr. Chairman, I'm on to K4. Yep.
Quick question on divided amendments in terms of procedure
Please
and
go ahead.
practice. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. We kind of had an interesting circumstance last year, and I'm going to need my colleagues to remind me of how it played out. But there was a little bit in the past, prior to this last year, there were never really any divisions that couldn't be broken at line numbers. And that has been our standard practice. And then we had one amendment this last year where we sort of decided to pick and choose some language and call it an acceptable division. I don't know where we say that it has to be on line numbers. Is that here in the manual? Was that historical practice? Or do we not have that anywhere? I mean, I know where Mason's talks about all it has to do is be two questions that reasonably stand alone, I believe is how Mason's characterizes it. It doesn't care about line numbers. We have tended to rely on line numbers, but I don't know if that's explicit or tradition.
Mr. Groover?
Mr. Chairman, I was trying to quickly get to the rules, but my computer shut down. Senator Rothfuss, I don't know off the top of my head. I can tell you in the House what the practice has been, and it hasn't been line numbers. The practice in the House is if you take language out and it makes no sense either way, what's left or what you're voting on, makes no sense standing alone without adding language to it. We've always instructed the chief clerks that that's not divisible. And again, I didn't staff the Senate that much. I can't tell you if the Senate's followed that rule. And I don't know the particular one you're talking about, but I can tell you line numbers is never controlled. It's the language that's left that you're voting on or the language that you're not voting on. If either one of those don't stand by themselves without the additional language, it's not a divisible amendment. And I'll look real quick while Matt or Ellen fills in any questions there.
You know, in my, just in my 10 years, I can't remember where we didn't break on an amendment on lines, but my interpretation was always what Mr. Groover just said, that it was more on the subject. Is that two different questions like Mason puts it? But I don't know that I've ever recall a time where we broke a line.
And
I concur, Mr. Chairman, that's my recollection in all my years in the Senate as well. Senator Rothfuss is right. We have run into a couple of things the last 2 years, one of which I think went to a rules committee, Senator Rothfuss, if I remember correctly, but generally agree with you, Mr. Chairman.
Senator Rothfuss, you got anything else on this?
Well, Dave was going to weigh in. I'll wait for him, but then I'll weigh in.
Okay, Mr. Chairman, the Senate rule is 11-4, and it doesn't speak to line numbers. What it says is it shall be divided if it comprehends propositions in substance so distinct that one being taken away, a substantive proposition shall remain for the decision of the Senate. And that language I interpret to be just what we've always advised our House. You take one away and you still have something that makes sense for a vote, regardless of line and page numbers.
Yep, that sounds good. And so that is consistent with what we did, whether it was this last year or the prior year. I think it was just a anomalous circumstance that we actually broke somewhere other than page specific line numbers. But yeah, I think we handled it in a way that was in order, and I was curious about whether that was somewhere. So all right, it isn't, and that's good to know. Thank you.
All right, please proceed.
Mr. Chairman, we're closing in here on the end. I'm on K2, governor's vetoes. We just add 3 days excluding Sundays, and that's in the Constitution to act. And again, just putting it there to make it clear. We have, on K2, an amendment just to strike beginning in 1997. We missed that. And we took those out everywhere else. K4, we've already talked about the substantive issue. Legislature's taken the position, if you haven't adjourned sine die, that the clerk can stay and the governor has to get the bill back to the clerk within the 3 days. Page K6, Mr. Chairman. Again, we're just inserting this practice and precedent here. At one point, the legislature, based on the Constitution saying you shall consider veto overrides, thought that they actually had to take a vote on everything, even if they had no intention on overriding. Both houses have determined that no, you don't have to. The Constitution doesn't require that. And as a matter of practice, I don't know how it could be interpreted any other way. You couldn't bring a mandamus action to require a House or the Senate to undertake an action. You can't require people to vote if they don't want to.
Mr. Chairman, quick on that.
Yep.
This is something that's come up in discussion a number of times, Mr. Chairman, about who has the authority to call for a vote on a veto override, because it typically kind of comes to the body as these are the things that we, whoever the we is, have decided that we're going to take a vote on an override of. And it's not by motion of members of the chamber, and it's almost as if there isn't a right of an individual member to have that, because I don't think it's clear anywhere that a member could call a motion to override a veto. I believe that's fully in order. I can't imagine why an individual member wouldn't have that authority. But I don't know where it says any of that. So is that something where maybe we're lacking a little bit of procedural, or am I wrong in that we don't do veto overrides unless the majority leader of the chamber decides we are?
Mr. Gruber, and I'm going to hand the chair over to Senator Landon for a second.
Okay, Mr. Chairman, Senator, I can tell you this, you don't talk about vetoes at all in your rules. I've never seen a member make a motion. Sitting here just now thinking about it, I don't know why you couldn't make a motion to do so. It's not listed in your order of business or anything else, and I don't know that you have any limitation in the manual or anywhere else that the majority floor leader, who normally conducts business, and I guess that would be where the argument comes, is that the majority floor leader could take the position that the rules provide that they determine the order of business, and it's not on there. Honestly, I think you're probably right that any member could, but I don't think it's adopted or addressed anywhere in the rules or in the manual.
And Mr. Gruber, Mr. Chairman.
Go ahead, Tamara. My apologies. Go ahead.
Certainly. The House has had several members that the LSO has prepared scripts to help them introduce their own veto overrides. I don't believe they've either done those and had a ruling, or they may have been voted against, but certainly in the last 3 to 4 years, we've prepared members to help address any overrides they want to submit to the body.
Tamara, that's helpful. Just to put in with Senator Rothfuss, I think that it's just been tradition in the Senate that leadership gets together and then shares with some members of the majority, hey, here's the ones we're going to try to override. And Mr. Gruber, thanks for reminding us. It just seems like anyone could propose that kind of amendment, as apparently has been done in the House. But Senator Rothfuss, that just never happened during our time.
Yeah, Mr. Chairman, that's correct, and obviously it's going to be a hard vote if you're an island of one trying to override a veto. So that's probably a part of it. But I think I don't know if we need to mention it, or it sounds like it's sort of taking care of itself, that any senator or any House member has standing when the chamber is doing business with standard business, that they could make a request of override a veto, and that would be in order. There's certainly nothing precluding it. We usually do call out in a book like the Manual of Procedure saying that something is a motion that's in order, and it's, I guess, somewhat curious that that's not a motion that's ever mentioned as being in order, to my knowledge. I don't even know how it's in order. Do we have it? I guess it's just right here. This is the only time has determined the language. Is this the only place where motions related to veto overrides is mentioned, or did we have them in the list of allowable motions above?
Mr. Gruber, thoughts on that?
Mr. Chairman, it's not in the list of allowable motions. And really, that list doesn't encompass, Senator, all motions by any stretch of the imagination. It's just the most common motions made,
Fair.
really just as a guide and a help
Yeah.
to the chief clerks and the members
Okay.
of what kind of vote you need for most of the motions and how you would phrase the motion.
Great, thank you. And
So,
I don't know that
thank
we
you.
need any changes, Mr. Chairman. I just something that I was making sure that we talked through.
No, I appreciate that, Senator. And Tamara, could you maybe make a note that when we do visit with the Management Council on this, that we had some discussion right here. And we can at least, alert them to that. I agree with the senator. I don't think we need changes, but that's up to Management Council.
Yes, I'll make a note and I'll go back through and find out if any of those were ever introduced on the floor.
Thank you for that, Tamara. That would be helpful as well. Please proceed, Mr. Gruber.
Okay, Mr. Chairman, I'm all the way to M3, Appendix M3. And what we do actually on 1 and 2 is strike from the manual all the sample interim committee rules. It's because you actually have those in your joint rules now. So there's no need to repeat exactly the same thing. But we do have a couple substantive provisions for the manual here, Mr. Chairman. And that requires, the first one is kind of a delicate issue. What happens if the House and Senate adopt different, quote, joint rules for an interim committee? And what's happened in the past is that the Senate wanted a majority vote of each House, and the House wanted a majority vote of the whole committee. LSO provided a memo that their best view would be that the quorum of the entire committee gets to decide the issue. But since it was a joint rule and it was actually adopted separately and differently, the LSO printed both rules. And under the joint rule said the Senate adopted this joint rule and the House adopted this joint rule. Here's how LSO is going to interpret it. And that's where we left it, and that's the status, and that's one I don't know that is easily resolvable by this select committee or anyone, Mr. Chairman, but all we do really is recite the status. The second issue for interim committee work is the issue of proxy voting or absentee voting. And here the manual leaves this committee or management council, whoever decides it at the end, 3 choices. And obviously these are just recommendations for the rules committee for each body to adopt. But for what you're gonna put in front of those bodies, you have 3 choices. One is to allow it subject to the discretion of the chairman. 2 is prohibit it completely. And 2 would follow what Masons generally does, which is if you're not present in committee when the question's put, you don't get to vote. And 3 is a kind of a compromise position, which is up to the chairman, but the member shall have attend a substantial portion of the committee's discussion of the issue. And the staff comments there notes that the House rule adds a requirement, and this is for during the interim, the House rules for during the session, which couldn't apply to the interim, is that the member is excused to attend another legislative meeting. I guess you could put that in there, but it's such a rare occasion that a member during the interim would have 2 legislative meetings that they would have to attend. It just wouldn't have much effect. You note in the staff comments, as I said, the rules are contrary to Masons. And historic precedent, the reason we gave you options here, Mr. Chairman, is because you've really done all 3 of these things. And at the bottom end of the day, I would say, in my experience, is you just let the chairman make the call.
Mr. Chairman.
I'll turn it back to Representative Summers. Mr. Chairman.
Senator Rothfuss.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So we use the phrase proxy voting, and this has been on a number of occasions over the years somewhat confusing, because proxy voting often means that I can leave my proxy with another legislator on an open question, whereas the absentee voting is going to mean you're going to fill out that vote or cast that vote, even though you're not present at the time the vote is cast, which is very different. And I guess I'm concerned that maybe one of the reasons why we keep having this discussion about, well, I'm going to give Representative Yin my proxy, and then Representative Yin has 2 votes instead of 1, is because we use the word proxy. Is that a word that we have to use? Do we use that elsewhere? Is that a term of art we require?
Mr. Chairman, it is a term of art. Do we have to use it? I don't think you do. And actually, Masons has provisions for pairing, which allows members to cancel out each other's vote in committees. The Wyoming legislature has never done that to my knowledge. Senator, proxy voting, absentee voting, I think they've been used interchangeably, but you're correct. They're really differently, which is you get to vote for me, proxy. Absentee voting is, Mr. Chairman, I'm voting XYZ, or I'm voting no on XYZ and voting aye on whatever, bill number A. And so they are somewhat different. And really, you could address them completely and say proxy voting is not allowed at all. Absentee voting, leaving your vote and require a written vote, so it's not proxy voting on certain things, Mr. Chairman. There are a number of different alternatives in here, and it's not really for me to suggest, but I will say this. There have been more contentious issues when a chairman has not made clear at the first meeting of the interim how they plan on handling that. And accusations, or I shouldn't call them accusations, but concerns that, oh no, they changed their rules midstream at the last meeting on the interim because they needed that vote. So I'll just throw that out there as you deliberate which one you want to do. That it seems to me that if whatever the rule you adopt or choose to recommend, if you require that to be done at the first meeting of the interim, that's it. And you don't get to change the way the rules are throughout the interim.
Thank you. And Mr. Chairman, I think that separating those out is important. And I think it is important to note for clarity that we do not allow proxy voting, that's an abrogation of legislative power, and we don't get to do that, but that absentee is subject to a variety of decisions and interpretations by the chairman.
So Senator Rothfuss, Mr. Chairman, having chaired a whole bunch of meetings, I think that I speak for a lot of other chairmen that I have worked with. We try to keep that fairly tight. But I agree with Mr. Gruber. It feels like that third option is something that we want to at least recommend, simply because there's times that things overlap or that we have great distances to cover. I've got one coming up on Wednesday, for example. I'll be in TRW, but that afternoon I'm supposed to be in Jackson to chair an air transportation meeting. So it's very likely that on the last issue, I'll try to stay for debate, leave a vote, and then take off. And most chairmen will allow that. And that seems reasonable to me, even though it goes against Mason.
Yeah, Mr. Chairman, and agreed. I certainly think absentee is important, and we definitely need to allow those exceptions. I don't think there's ever a case where proxy is in any way constitutionally legal.
So, Mr. Groover, I guess we'll, obviously come back to this after we've made the motion, and then we'll make a motion specifically on this piece. But I agree with Senator Rothfuss that that proxy is not a good thing. And I think absentee, I think we've got to decide, is absentee just, at the discretion of the chairman or the discretion of the chairman if a member has been substantially there. I think those were the kind of the two options. Senator Cost, please.
Thank you. To chime in on this just a little bit, first of all, I wholeheartedly agree with the proxy as not being allowed. But secondly, I really struggle with somebody that's going to provide an absentee ballot unless they have heard a reasonable amount of the discussion and have a good understanding of what's being presented. Because I think too often what somebody might say or a word of somebody else is what they're taking. And I don't know that that's always the best idea. I think it's better for them to hear that discussion. Obviously with Zoom, that helps out sometimes if there is a conflict, like Senator Landon's situation. He's going to make the best attempt to try to be there for the majority of it so he has knowledge of it before he makes a vote. I think that's being responsible to what you should be doing. So I do think that third one would make more sense than the other two.
Okay.
Mr. Chairman, I guess my recommendation on that then would be to flag it for consideration by Management Council. It might be appropriate for us to put together a rule. We shouldn't do it, I think, through the procedure manual at this point in time. That should be something really for an official rule of some sort, something that we really sink our teeth into and see what the chambers want. But I absolutely agree with what Senator Koss just said. I'm never a big fan of the person that leaves a couple of votes but didn't listen to any of the testimony.
Okay. Please proceed.
Mr. Chairman, that takes me to Appendix M5. And you'll see from the staff comment, this entire appendix is new, but it's really probably 95% is from the legislative handbook with updates. At one point we had changes in blue highlight, that's disappeared. So sorry, but you can ignore that language. I'll point out the changes from the legislative handbook. Other than that, it's more than precedent. It's in the handbook and this is what you follow. Mr. Chairman, standard procedure A1 is just an update to the extranet from the old postcard procedure. The provisions for that, again, postcard procedures and 2 were deleted. That's why there's no 2 there. There should be 3. It should be renumbered from there. The green sheets have been deleted. References to the green sheets that have been deleted. Really, the big change, Mr. Chairman, is what's labeled number 5, and this deals with the fiscal note and approval of the fiscal note. It's always been a bone of contention of what happens. You get a bill and we send it to an agency for a fiscal note, and sometimes the agencies like the bill, don't like the bill, and they put what may be considered a good fiscal note for pro bills and bad one for bills that they don't like, and the sponsor gets that back and he doesn't want to approve the bill because he doesn't agree with the fiscal note. So we note that we'll redraft if they request substantive changes. I'm sorry, I got ahead of myself. This is, if substantive changes are required, we make those, and if they're major, we send them back to co-sponsor, or tell the sponsor, you got to send this out to all the new co-sponsors because they may not agree to co-sponsor it now. If they're just technical changes, we go ahead and make those and don't alert the co-sponsors that they have to reapprove the bill. We assume that they're fine with technical changes. And you'll see on the last 2 sentences, we try to define what a substantive change is. and it's one that would foreseeably affect the legislature's decision to be a co-sponsor. Technical ones aren't substantive changes. And I know that's kind of waffle and kind of loose language, but that's really what we've done. And I can't say that there have been, again, Matt for the last 4 or 5 years can speak to it, but in my time for LSO, there really haven't been that many problems where co-sponsors have said, geez, I wouldn't have sponsored this LSO if you had told me about the change. Really, the bigger problem is LSO, at least when I was here, took a pretty harsh line in saying, no, that has to go out. Because, you know, with 500,000, the co-sponsor might have been on. Now that it's $1 million, co-sponsors might say, no, that's too much for me. In any event, it's something that the co-sponsors should really get a look at, and we're not going to go ahead and number that unless you get co-sponsors on it. And really, if there's a rub here, it's the rub is that sponsors are saying, hey, I want my bill to have a low number. And it's like, well, then what you should do is do it as is with 500,000 and prepare an amendment for the standing committee to make it, take it up to $1 million. So, Mr. Chairman, 5 is the historic practice of how LSOs handled it, and that's the background for it.
Mr. Gruber?
Yep.
You know, and I'm sure it's the same way in the Senate. Sometimes bills that we develop during session, even last session, I went and just got people to sign the bill jacket, just to get it done quicker, because you can get, you know, people may or may not be looking at their extranet all day, but if you want to get a bill out, you just go get it signed. So I don't know, and I'm sure that practice will continue. I just don't see where it's at in this.
Mr. Chairman, that's on the next page on M6, adding late co-sponsors. And you can do that. And if you do it before it's been given a number, then they're on the bill. After it gets a number, you can actually still have them sign the bill jacket, and then they get on the bill if it passes the first house. But that provision is all, and it is taken care of earlier. I don't know if you recall when I talked about you had to have a hard copy of approval. Well, we've always allowed, and then nothing changes there to allow you to take the bill jacket around and get that, and that's your hard copy. And actually, that's the best and easiest way to do it. The problem is, you know, the bills and floating around out there is all. But there's nothing in here that prohibits that, Mr. Chairman.
So, Mr. Chairman, just for clarification, when we take a bill around and seek those signatures on a jacket, are our members limited to 15 co-sponsors as well?
Mr. Chairman, no. That limitation is only on the number of co-sponsors that we put on, the LSO will send out to. It used to be a limitation on the number of postcards, and is actually drawn from the largest delegation. Back when they adopted that limitation, Mr. Chairman, for Laramie County had 15. And the thinking of Management Council was, we'll at least let the whole county delegation co-sponsor it. But we're not going to have LSO send out to 60 just so you can have 30 on there and avoid debate, basically, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Gruber. That makes sense. Appreciate it.
Just quickly, Senator Rothfuss, it's my understanding you have a meeting.
Yes, Mr. Chairman, I have a brief meeting at 11:30. I'll come back at about noon if we're still going, which presumably we will be.
So my question is to, I guess, will we have a quorum if you leave? Because I think we do, because Senator Landon's now. Do we have how many do we have on? What's our quorum number?
Mr. Chairman, that'd be 4. 4
Okay,
members.
we have it. So, okay, perfect. Thanks. Please
Thank you.
proceed.
Mr. Chairman, I'll go back to M6 at the very top. I note that there are options and that this is a historic practice. if members are uncomfortable with that historic practice and leaving that discretion, another option would be to simply say technical or grammatical changes are the only ones that don't require to be sent out for a new approval. And really, the issue you get into, Mr. Chairman, is a timing issue.
Please proceed.
Okay, Mr. Chairman, really the only additional language to the handbook is M6, the very last sentence, the LSO accepts co-sponsors either by hard copy or through the extranet. Okay, Mr. Chairman, M7 is the fiscal note that I start talking about. The statute requires that LSO provide fiscal notes for legislation, and under such forms and conditions as specified by joint rule of the legislature. Well, the legislature has never adopted a joint rule for the form and conditions for fiscal notes. We have a process in the manual, and we also require, it used to be that fiscal notes would only affect or note the effect on state government. The legislature changed that, I don't know, probably 10 years, maybe longer ago, to also say if you change distribution formulas or money flowing to the locals, that the fiscal note will also affect that. Fiscal notes don't go beyond that, Mr. Chairman, as far as effects on local governments. Mr. Chairman, M7, number A, or subparagraph A, we talk about at the state level and the changes to the total amount to local or to state or local under statutory formula. We added that in the manual because you added that in statute. So that just tracks the statute now. M7, subparagraph C. And this is our interpretation again, Mr. Chairman. The statute requires that fiscal notes be submitted to the sponsor for review and approval prior to attachment to the bill. We've always interpret that as the sponsor has to receive the fiscal note and approve it before the bill is numbered. And so we add that in there. And we talk about the timing, and then M8, Mr. Chairman, is a new one. And the staff comments shows that it reflects historic practice. But this is the issue, and it's one that comes up really fairly frequently, which is what happens when the sponsor insists on a fiscal note that LSO doesn't think is accurate. And we spell out in the manual, if the LSO and the sponsor can't agree on the estimated fiscal impact, the fiscal note will reflect that the estimate was not approved by the sponsor. And that's just the position LSO has taken because I can be blunt since I no longer work for anyone. Sponsors want to get their bill passed and they, well, this is going to do this, that, and the other. And, America's going to be great again kind of thing. And we're going to save $1 billion. Well, LSO says, well, we can't quantify any of that. But what we can quantify is this amendment has to go on the ballot, and the ballot amendment costs $40,000 to run. And the sponsor says, yeah, I want you to talk about the $1 billion it's going to save. And they're insistent on it. And LSO at the end of the day says, no, we just can't do that in good faith because we don't know that. We don't have the capability of making that determination. But we do know it's going to cost $40,000. And that would be an example of where the sponsor said, well, I disagree with your fiscal note. And LSO would note the sponsor doesn't agree with the fiscal note. It's LSO's best estimation of the fiscal impact. Again, Mr. Chairman, you are elevating precedent and practice to a manual and really codifying by the legislative adoption of the bodies of this, that practice. And the truth of the matter is what it does, in my view, is it provides LSO a little bit of protection when you have those instances where a legislator is just insistent that this is what they want because it's their bill and they want their bill to say that. And LSO is like, well, yeah, but it's also our fiscal note. And LSO's reputation is on the line. And again, Mr. Chairman, once you go down that road and say you get to put on fiscal notes whatever the bill sponsor wants, you're really opening the barn door, in my opinion.
Totally agree, Mr. Gruber. Please continue.
I'm on N9, Mr. Chairman, amendment procedures. And again, this is really drawn from the legislative handbook. The big difference here is on number 2, House and Senate attorneys. And this is, again, reflects historic practice. And you can read the language yourself, but here's the situation. You come in, Mr. Chairman, and you have, I want this amendment to this bill. It's simple. The bill's going to be up on third reading today. Well, or let me take it back. It's going to be up on committee of the whole today. It's like, okay, fine, we can do that. But boom, 8 legislators come in and they want a bunch of second and third reading. Even though we normally do things in the order they come in, I would say that's not coming up today. It might not even come up till tomorrow because it's on committee of the whole. We've got to get these in here now. And so we changed in the House Attorney's Office the order of when they're submitted to when we actually produce them. Really, and it, bottom line is just to keep the flow going as well as we can based on our experience. And the same thing goes for complicated amendments versus simple amendments. Senator so-and-so brings it in and it's a 10-page amendment. We got to talk to agencies to figure out how to do it right. 6 legislators come in and guess what? We did all their amendments in front of his because they each took 10 minutes to do. And we could number those 1, 2, 3 and keep on going. And now, you know, amendment number 7 is just 10-pager that changes the whole bill. And so we do that. And honestly, and again, Matt can talk to the last 4 or 5 years, but in my experience, we've really not had very many issues with legislators. They understand what we're doing and they understand that that's the reason we're doing it. And it's really just to keep things moving. And so you never have to stand down. And that's what this amendment does, Mr. Chairman, or the insertion of this language does. Mr. Chairman, on confidentiality of amendments, again, this is legislative handbook. It's a little bit different. And generally speaking, amendments aren't confidential to other legislators. And if you have an amendment and the next representative comes in and they have the same or almost exactly the same amendment, we'll tell them, hey, look, we're already working on that for Representative so-and-so. Will you want to talk to them and see if you want to jointly sponsor it and maybe work out some of the language between you? Again, that's how we do it. And I'll say this, from when I first started LSO to when I left LSO, that became more of the standard. At the very beginning, it was more, no, hush, hush. But the legislature's really accommodated themselves to make things work better by let other legislators know what's going on. And that language is reflected in here. Distribution of amendments under D, that's changed a little bit. And if I'm wrong, the chief clerk of the Senate here can tell me. The House has always done, as soon as we're done with second reading amendments on the bill and the bill's done past second reading, we put the third amendments out that very day for a bill considered the next day. The Senate used to hold everything until the morning that bill was on third reading. I think the Senate has changed. Yep, Ellen confirms that the Senate has changed. And again, the point is just to get the public and members more notice. We're done with second reading. Here's what's coming on third reading for the bill. You can talk, go home and have dinner. I'll talk with constituents over the whole thing. You know what's coming up for third reading. And again, that's reflected in the manual. And it's historic practice now in both or at least recent practice in the Senate. Mr. Chairman, co-sponsors, again, historic practice. If you tell me X, Y, and Z are agreed to co-sponsor, we don't go out there and check with X, Y, and Z. We take your word for it. At least until we're burnt, and that almost never happens. And so again, that just codifies that practice. And finally, Mr. Chairman, I'm on N11, and the last thing that I'll have to talk about, substitute bills. This is from an LSO memo. We did it probably about 10 years ago. Everybody's always confused about substitute bills. How do we do this? How do we do that? This just puts it in historic practice in the manual. And basically what it is only a chairman or committee can ask for a substitute bill. And then we'll make a sub X. And that's just an amendment. And that is published on the website because it's a proposed amendment to the bill. And everybody gets to see that. And the committee then works on what the chairman had asked, because everybody kind of is in agreement with what they want. If the committee passes that bill, it just becomes a sub 1 when it comes down. If the committee says, no, we want a lot of changes, we'll do a sub Y to the bill. But that's just for the committee to look at, Mr. Chairman, and take back. And then once they approve that, then it becomes a sub 1. Well, it's a sub X until the House votes on it, and you'll have that little amendment that substitute, number 1 do pass, and that's the process. Again, 98% of this is from an LSO memo, and there's really no changes, but we're just putting it in there for clarification, for help for future legislators and LSO staff and chief clerks. And that's it, Mr. Chairman.
All right, do the committee members have any questions of Mr. Gruber or Mr. Obrecht?
Mr.
If
Chairman.
not, Rep. Yen, did you?
Yes, Mr. Chairman, a question for Mr. Obrecht. So I think, Mr. Obrecht, you mentioned before that the growth in substitute bill requests has grown. Is there anything that you'd like to further expound on that, or are there specific circumstances? Would having this in the manual help with that concern? Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Matt, Mr. Gruber?
Mr. Chairman, Representative Yen, good question. Having this in the manual certainly won't hurt, but it does not really provide any sort of definition of when a substitute bill would be appropriate. And I don't know if it really could. We say in an instant when a bill is so heavily amended that it can't be readily understood without a substitute bill. And we can hang our hat on that language when talking to chairman about, you're really not changing the bill to that great of an extent. And the other thing we have done before too, and this doesn't make it into the manual, and this is even rarer than a substitute bill, but sometimes we'll do an amendment to say delete page 1, line 1 through page 10, line 20, and then do a complete amendment in a substitute bill format that way. We don't advertise that. It's not really an option we want the members to know of, but we've done that before. So I guess, Representative Yen, to your point, I don't think right now we need anything else but what's in these proposed changes on a substitute bill. If LSO believes that it's becoming more of an issue, we can address it through the Rules Committee at that time.
Okay, any other questions, Senator Landon? Anything before?
Mr. Chairman, thank you. Just a couple of things that came to mind before the meeting, and I apologize if you touched on these early in the day when I was trying to get back here to the office and having a little bit of difficulty. I thought about possession of bills in whatever chamber. We've run into that issue a little bit, and wondered if in the procedures manual, if we needed to touch on that at all. Moving for a reconsideration of a bill, for example. So there's that issue. The second issue that I thought of, Mr. Chairman, is we have had, just in recent years since I've been in, it seems like there's more of a prevalence of some members drafting lots and lots of bills. Whether or not they bring them or not, we limit that. But I'm wondering if you visited early in the day about that, or if there was any comments from Director Obrecht with regard to the pressures that we're putting on our staff there. It just seems like we've got people drafting a lot of bills.
So Matt, I think let's take them in two pieces. So the reconsideration, it's always been if the bill in the House, if the bill jacket's still in possession of the clerk, then a reconsideration is appropriate. If the bill jacket is moved to the Senate, then it's not. Did we have that kind of in this document at all? Kind of how that actually occurs as far as who has possession, how possession is determined? Mr. Gruber or Matt, either one.
Mr. Chairman, I think that's adopted, that's clear in rules, and then once it goes to the other house, you do have to recall it, to act on it, to reconsider it. The manual addresses that in a little bit more detail when it talks to a bill having been sent to the LSO for engrossing. That's the only time you have a question. It's either in one house or the other, unless it's gone to LSO in between for engrossing. And the language that we put in here in the manual is, if it's in the LSO's possession for engrossing, technical grammatical changes can be made, and those are things that the bill processing catches and brings to the House attorneys, and we do the corrected amendment. Other than that, it's out of the House's possession, and you have to make a motion to recall it from the second House. I'll let Matt talk about the bill numbers.
So, Mr. Chairman, just real quickly on that front, and thank you, Mr. Gruber, for the reminder. It's been a little bit inconsistent as it would be. I mean, depending on what kind of days you're having in a particular session, the bills move out of there more quickly than other days, perhaps. But it has come up in the Senate chamber, the request of a reconsideration, and the reply is, no, that bill has already left. And I just wondered the other day if there was some sort of consistency that we wanted to think about there, but I think we're fine, Mr. Chairman, unless somebody feels the same way. We have had over the last 3 or 4 years a couple more requests for reconsideration of bills than it seems like we used to. So thank you for that.
You bet. Okay, on the bill drafts, I mean, we'd have to do that in rule. I mean, correct, Matt? I mean, if we wanted to limit the number of bill requests, and I think I had this discussion at one point with you, and you know, I'm not sure we can do that, right? And can we limit the number of bill requests even?
Well, Mr. Chairman, I think the bodies could limit the number of bill requests through your rules if that was the desire. It's never been the desire of the bodies before to limit those requests. I don't think right now we're facing any sort of emergency or you know, that staff is so busy with the current number of bill requests that we would need to take some measure to limit those. I would say what we're seeing now is potentially an uptick in the number of late requests we get. While the total number of requests are steady, consistent, we get more requests later in the interim, and that frankly just doesn't result in as good of a product when the drafts come in late. The other pressure point we see in the number of requests being made is budget bill amendments. We have seen certain members request a substantial number of budget bill amendments. That's especially hard on staff, given the need to draft those in a short period of time and then also have outstanding draft budget bill amendments and needing to know how to number those appropriately and also manage the flow between the two houses on identical amendments. But Mr. Chairman, at this time, I wouldn't request any sort of rule to deal with those issues. Maybe we see how things go during this legislature and if something would be needed after that.
Senator Landon, does that answer your question?
It does. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate the director just having that conversation. Thank you.
All right. Are there any other questions of staff? So, Mr. Groover or Matt, kind of the order I think I'd like to go is first, we'll get a motion on the main manual, the first draft 1, and then probably the first amendment that I would like to see is the draft amendments that were written up by Mr. Groover that were submitted to us. And then we will go through, after that, we'll go through in whatever order Mr. Groover or Matt wrote down where we had question marks. In other words, where we may want to go in and take a look to see whether we want to amend any section that we had kind of put a note on. Does that, Matt, does that seem reasonable?
Mr. Chairman, it certainly does.
So with that, I would entertain a motion on the first draft of the amendments for the legislative procedures.
So moved, Mr. Chairman.
Moved by Senator Landon, second by Cost. Now, would anybody like to make a motion on the written up amendments that were submitted by staff?
So moved.
Moved by Rep. Yin, second by Cost. All those in favor of that, any discussion on those amendments, any changes to those amendments that you'd like to make? If not, all those in favor of those amendments signify by raising your hand. Motion carries. Now, Matt, maybe we could, or Dave, maybe we could scroll through, and I think the first one we should take up, and Senator Rothfuss is still not here, so let's hold off on that one for a minute. And that one being, do we want to make these, I guess, our historic practices, should they be considered a rule or should they be considered not a rule? When we pass that, how do we want to handle that recommendation to management council? So I guess let's discuss this a bit. So Matt and Dave, let's talk a little bit about that concept. So you guys, I think, Matt, you were the one that brought up the rule that would say basically, hey, when we adopt this at the beginning of session, we're adopting it as if it were a rule, through a rule. Dave had a bit of a different interpretation, which would go more along the lines of what Senator Rothfuss was concerned about, that our historic practices really aren't full force and effective rule. We could change those by majority vote, any challenge to the chair. when he cited historic rules. So Matt, maybe take it away.
Okay, Mr. Chairman. Yeah, I think that you accurately recapped our prior discussion on that. Reflecting on it here, and also when you also consider the role of Mason's Manual of Legislative Procedure in its order of precedence and its procedural hierarchy within the House and Senate, I tend to think that Dave's interpretation is the better one, that deviating from anything in the Wyoming Manual of Legislative Procedure would not need a suspension of the rules or the vote requirement, the 2/3 vote. But I also think that that's open for interpretation. I think that, one easy way to deal with that would be to amend Senate Rule 1-1 to specify that any deviation from the procedures as laid out in the Wyoming Manual of Legislative Procedure shall be done upon majority vote of the Senate. I would also suggest that the House amend its Rule 1-1 to more clearly recognize the authority of the manual, and then to also make that same amendment. And then, Mr. Chairman, we could also make that kind of amendment in the Joint Rule 10-1.
So Matt, this is Albert, and correct me if I'm wrong, but I think in the House, and I might be wrong, but I think we've assumed that the manual had the full force and effect of rule, and that it took, if we were referring to the manual as our, and something that wasn't stated in rule, and we go to the manual and we make that statement that it was full force and effect of rule and it took 2/3. Have we done that, or am I mistaken on it?
Mr. Chairman, and I'll defer to Dave here, but in my time in the House and as director, I don't remember an instance in the House where a deviation from the manual, the ruling of the chair was that it required a 2/3 vote, unless that manual was that deviation was simply an interpretation of a rule. And Dave, if you've got a different memory, go ahead.
Mr. Chairman, I don't remember the presiding officer ever saying this is based on the manual and therefore it requires a 2/3 vote to overrule. I think it would be just a motion to overrule the ruling of the chair, and you'd follow that rule.
Okay, I think so. Probably, and then that would also go for the legislative manual. So we put aside Masons, and let's just say that it takes a majority, and we could address that in a rule change. What about the legislative procedure manual? I assume that's been the same, that our historic practices, basically the historic practices that will be in there, would not require a suspension of the rule. But we would have to probably put that in the rule, right, Matt?
Mr. Chairman, just to make sure I'm following you, that, right, a deviation by the House, by action of the House from the language of the Manual of Legislative Procedure or of Mason's, I'm not aware of any instance where it's required anything more than, like Dave said, the ruling of the chair to to just a majority vote of the body. The rules could specify that, that if you wanted to deviate from or follow a different procedure as outlined in the manual, that would just require a majority vote of the body. And, you know, I think the Senate is maybe, again, a little clearer in that, in the adoption of the manual, and only requires a majority vote under Senate Rule 1-1. And the changes to that manual only requires a majority vote, whereas changes to your adopted rules, of course, require a 2/3 vote.
So Matt, this is just my opinion, and I'm interested in the committee's opinion, but I think it, you know, let's just say we may or may not go down the path of a rule, but wouldn't it be good to state in this manual that Masons and historic practice do not require a 2/3 majority to overrule them? Just a simple majority will suffice. We could even put it in the majority vote section. But do you two think there's value first, and then I'll go to the committee, in putting it in here so it's at least somewhat clear in a pinch that that's what's going on?
Mr. Chairman, I do. You know, if that's the will of the subcommittee, I think that would be beneficial to clarify.
So, Senator Landon, I'll go with you first.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman, and not to interrupt, but I appreciate you going down this line, because when Director Obrecht mentioned Senate 1-1, House 1-1, my question was going to be, how do we want to deal with that today with respect to the manual? And do we go forward with a recommendation that the Senate deal with this and the House deal with it? It sounds like maybe we can, by what you're suggesting, kind of deal with it here. So I appreciate this line of conversation. I think we're on the right track.
Representative Yen, did you have a comment, question?
Yes, Mr. Chairman. So I actually do agree that I think we should make it clear, at least in the House rules, we don't have any vote requirement for whether that manual applies to us. It does apply to us in the joint rule, but changing the manual has no vote requirement outlined in the rules, as far as I can tell, for the House side. It does for the Senate side. So I think us having a majority vote requirement for the manual on the House side would be good, but I also think that also outlining that suspending any of the manual sections also would just be a majority vote. I am a little hesitant to put in rules that a majority vote would suspend any Mason rule, because I worry that will lead people down a road where we'll just take majority votes to override supermajority 2/3 votes, and I worry about what that could mean. I know it's possible. I don't know if we need to put it in the set of rules for that, though.
Just, I guess, a comment or question I might have, and it's, you know, my recollection's shaky at best. But I think 2 years ago, as majority floor leader, I had set the time when we were done with committee of the whole on the last day of committee of the whole. And I think there was a motion at the end of that time period, maybe to bring a bill out. But I think the clock is in the hands of the majority floor leader, was in Mason's, but not in rule. And it took, I can't remember all of that, but it seemed like in the end, it was a 2/3 majority. It was ruled by the presiding officers to be a 2/3 majority to do that action. And I guess that's also then a simple majority, right? That could be once again challenged. So I guess we don't. I guess in the end we still provide leeway to the presiding officer to make a call and then be challenged either way. But what about the clock? Matt, do you remember that, or Dave? I don't know that you were around, but it had to do with setting the clock. Like this is when it ends, and that can be done. But I think it might be in Masons and not in Rule. Did I lose Matt or Dave?
No, sorry, Mr. Chairman. We were just talking offline in the room here to see if either of us could remember that exact situation. And so, just so I can be clear, you made the motion that the Committee of the Whole rise and report, and the question was whether it took a 2/3 vote to overrule your motion to rise and report. Is that correct?
No, it was that I had established the end date at a certain time prior. I had just said that basically I'd said at 7 o'clock, committee of the whole will end at 7 o'clock. And, but anyway, we don't need to get into that now, but it's just, I think it's worthwhile that we have a motion here, if the committee agrees, that the historic practices, at the very least, that historic practices should be a majority vote to change and not a 2/3 majority. So if anybody believes that, then I think it's an appropriate time to make that motion.
I would make that motion, Mr. Chairman.
Moved by Landed, second by Cost. Any discussion on the motion? Senator Rothfuss.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. When phrased, it might be important to just be clear about, if there's a rule underlying it, which there are in some cases in the manual, you get yourself into a complex space where part of it's rule and part of it's tradition, and you can only overrule the tradition part, not the rule part. I guess that will probably be self-evident, but it's just a point of caution when drafting that we need to be careful that there's no implication that you can just overrule anything in the manual of procedure with a 2/3, because a lot of it is simply an interpretation of an underlying rule. But I definitely support the motion, obviously.
So, I'm going to take that as a kind of a cleanup of the motion. If the mover and the second agree that we don't want to have any implication that we would overturn a rule with a majority, only historic practices that are not subject to a rule. Matt, would that make sense? Dave?
Well, Mr. Chairman, I wasn't going to say anything, but I think it's very difficult, even in your current manual, you have a number of things that are interpretations, and a number of things that are placed in there because they are practices of the legislative body. And I just think it's very difficult to make that demarcation without explicitly saying in the manual. And I can tell you this, when I made my changes, I didn't explicitly figure out which one had a rule underlying it and which one doesn't have a rule underlying it. Your rules provide only for a 2/3 vote for suspension of the rules. Otherwise, an appeal from a ruling of the chair is a simple majority vote of those present. And I think if you go down this and you start saying certain parts of the manual, majority, certain parts of 2/3, now you've elevated the manual and interpretations of the manual to a rule status. And I just don't know if you really want to go there without writing the manual in such a way that the blue highlight are rule interpretation, the pink highlight are precedent and practice interpretation. My recommendation is when the chair makes a ruling, they say pursuant to Rule 2.1, as interpreted Masons or by the manual, we can't do that. And now you have a 2/3 vote because you say pursuant to Rule 2.1. If you say, well, it looks like here's what we think we've done in the past, and here's what the manual, how it interprets what we've done, then you just have a ruling from the chair. I just think it'd be very complicated, and you'll engender more arguments than you'll solve by doing this. But, you know, it's for the committees, but that's just my take on it. Because the manual is not written that precisely.
So that's a good point. We may want to rethink this, Senator Rothfuss.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. But Dave's interpretation just now is not necessarily the interpretation because it doesn't say anywhere that the manual of procedure isn't elevated to rule status. In fact, we have a rule that says the manual of procedure is to be taken effectively as rule or is adopted. So I don't know. I feel as though what Mr. Gruber just said is an interpretation, which is in and of itself subject to debate unless we say what he said somewhere, which is that the manual of procedure is not to be taken as rule in and of itself, which I think is the heart of the motion. That's what we want to get to, is the idea that the manual of procedure is an interpretation of rules and is not the rule itself and shouldn't be treated as a rule from a 2/3 standpoint. So if there's a better way to say that, I'm interested in hearing it. That's the objective, is to clarify that absent a rule, this is a suggestion.
Mr. Chairman, I'd only say, I'm sorry, but what I wrote down was that the motion was that those provisions that are historic practice only require a majority vote to overrule. That's different than what I just heard Senator Rothfuss say, which is the manual only requires a majority rule. That's an easy and I think a clear provision, that if the ruling is based on the manual, it's a majority vote to overrule. If the ruling is based on a rule, then it's a 2/3 vote. But the motion itself that I'd written down was historic practice provisions of the manual. And that was my problem, is that I don't know how you distinguish those, because the manual is really not that clear on what is historic practice and what is interpretation. And I think the two mix, actually.
So what I would ask is for the Senator Cost, we're still on the current motion, which I think was accurately stated.
My concern would be, is that going to get into the Masons then? Because I am a little worried about what that opens as far as doors, if also now the Masons rules are allowed to be just a majority. Then that to me could have implications that might not be in our best interest.
So committee, we can vote up or vote down this motion, or the maker of the motion can withdraw this and we can try it differently.
Mr. Chairman, I would certainly be willing to withdraw that motion if the second agrees, and we can tackle it again in a different way. So I would move that we withdraw the motion.
Seems like that's been withdrawn. Senator Rothfuss, do you want to make a cleaner motion?
Yeah, Mr. Chairman, starting with the concept then, and I was just thinking about the idea of in the absence of a rule, but we might not need to say that. It might just get back to what we described a moment ago, Mr. Groover in that the manual of procedure or overriding the manual of procedure shall require only a majority of members and I guess it's not that clean because we still need to be explicit. My apologies. We still need to be explicit about the fact that that doesn't entitle you to override an underlying rule.
So Matt, do you have any suggested language after listening to us mutter around here? I think what we want to do is have the legislative manual be by majority vote, but rules still require a 2/3 majority to overrule.
Mr. Chairman, it felt like Mr. Groover was very close with how he described that to us.
Mr. Chairman, maybe we can we'll take a crack at it. Under Senate Rule 1-3, which I think is identical to House Rule 1-3. Well, not identical, but it says no standing rules of the Senate shall be rescinded, changed, or suspended except by a vote of at least 2/3 of the members duly elected. We can say that no provision of the Wyoming Manual of Legislative Procedure shall be rescinded, changed, or suspended except by a vote of at least a majority of the members duly elected. And I think you might want to list that under either 1-1 at a C or put it under 1-3 under the rules. I think if you put it under 1-3 under the rules, it would be clearer that a change to the rules would require the 2/3 vote, but a change to the manual would only be the majority. And the interpretation then would be that if the manual provision is an interpretation of a rule, that if you need to suspend that rule that goes with the interpretation, that would require the 2/3 vote.
So committee, this is right now we're working on the legislative manual. We're not working on rules. So if we want to suggest or recommend a rule change, then we do that. I don't know then, Matt, this is a question back to you. I'm not sure then we want to make this, if our intent would be, for example, to make this a proposed rule change, that's different than establishing separate language in this manual. I see Senator Rothfuss has his mic open, so I assume he has a comment question.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. The thought there is, while it definitely works in the rules, we can create a provision right at the top of this manual, like at the very 1.0, which dictates the terms and conditions of any content within this manual, and it would bind itself. So if we wanted to lower the barrier, in other words, if we wanted exactly what Matt just said to apply only to this document, I think it can be the 1.0 of this document, but that, because that is governed then by the rule provision. But now that we go into the document and it says that it's only subject to a majority for interpretation or something along those lines, that should be governing for the rest of the document. And then we wouldn't have to have a rule change to get there. I guess I'd look to Dave and Matt to see if they would agree with that.
Dave or Matt, just one comment I would have quickly is if we put it in this manual, I think we have to have some statement alongside that to change any rule still requires approval through, and you can list the House rule number and the Senate rule number. You know, that rule changes are pursuant to, you know, whatever the rule number is. So Matt and Dave, any more thoughts here how we might proceed?
Mr. Chairman, Matt informed me that he thinks either would work fine. I agree that you could put it in the manual, and I probably would put it in the manual as opposed to the rule. And just one thing that I think you got to be clear, and we should make clear in the language, and I was trying to work on it here, is that your Senate rule requires a change to the manual to be made by a majority vote of the members of the Senate. I don't think you want that for trying to overrule a ruling of the chair based on the manual. I think what you want is a majority vote of those present to overrule a ruling of the chair based on a language of the manual or an interpretation of the manual. So you're not changing the manual, but for overruling the ruling of the presiding officer, it requires a majority vote of those present if it's based on reading of the manual. And Senator, that might be further than what you want, but I think it's an important discussion to have, whether you want a majority vote of the members elected, which is what the Senate rule would require. The House rule doesn't talk about it, or just a majority vote of those present.
So this is my suggestion, Senator Rothfuss, perhaps make a conceptual motion, if you like it, to that effect. And we let staff kind of clean it up. Obviously, this is going to be a recommendation we're making back to Management Council. So I think that's kind of what you want to see, right, Senator Rothfuss?
Mr. Chairman, yes, the one additional concern on that, though, is there's overruling the chair, and then there's suspension of an aspect of the Manual of Legislative Procedures. And we would want, in my view, both of those to be allowable by that majority, assuming that it doesn't come into conflict with a rule, right? So I think they can work that out. The reason I say that is it gets back to the nuance before. I'm happy to, if the chair makes a ruling and the ruling is factually accurate, I don't want to overrule that ruling, even though I might be happy to suspend the procedure, right? Those are two very different things, and we don't want to confuse them. So I think we should have, like, the 1.0 include both a suspension and an overruling of the chair. And honestly, getting back into the weeds a little bit there, sorry, is I don't think a majority of those present should have the authority to suspend an aspect of the Manual of Legislative Procedures. But I'm okay with a majority of those present moving against a ruling.
So are you making that in the form of a motion?
Sure, I'll make that in the form of a motion if it was clear enough.
Is there a second to that? Second by Cost. So ultimately what we got here, the way I think I interpreted it accurately. So, you know, a suspension is by those elected. An overrule of the chair is by those present. Or I should say a suspension by those elected.
Yep.
Yeah, an overrule by those present.
So I think to clarify the motion, it would be a motion so that we incorporate a leadoff provision like the 1.0 that any provision of the Wyoming Manual of Legislative Procedures may be suspended with a majority of those duly elected. A ruling pursuant to the Wyoming Manual of Legislative Procedures may be overruled by a majority of those members present. And then I think you need a third aspect of the motion that explicitly clarifies nothing in this provision shall allow for the suspension of any rule. Yeah, I think that works. With better language, obviously.
Okay, Senator Costa, are you still good with that? Senator Costa still, the second is still good. First, I'm gonna send it back to Dave, I guess.
Yeah.
And or Matt to see if that all makes sense, if they have enough direction. And then we'll proceed to discuss it more and vote on it.
Mr. Chairman, it makes sense to me, 3 parts of a 1.0.
Sounds good.
And Mr. Chairman, if I may ask Dave.
Go ahead.
Dave, you've worked on this for a long time. Does that conceptually work for you also? I mean, makes sense, but do you think it works in business practice?
Dave.
Honestly, Mr. Chairman, I think it's going to come down to a clever presiding officers, how they frame their ruling as to whether it's based on on the manual or whether it's based on their interpretation of the manual. But I think it works.
Okay. Any discussion on this amendment? All those in favor signify by raising your hand. Motion carries. Okay, Matt or Dave, do we have, other than, I know right towards the end, we kind of had that 3 choice on how to proxy versus absentee. Did we have another place in the document that we were looking at an amendment perhaps?
Mr. Chairman, you know, before I turn that over to Dave to answer, just want for the full subcommittee and for the members of the House, there is likely a need to clarify in rule, or at least to propose rule clarifications on the procedural authority of this manual and the House rule, and also what changes to the manual through the joint rule, if we want to make that consistent with the Senate rule, or leave it as it's provided in the joint rule. And it can stand alone as it is right now, but there are different procedures for that. The Senate says changes to the manual requires a majority vote of those elected to the Senate. Changes to the manual in the joint rule 10-1 shall be made only with the consent of the Rules Committee of the Senate and House. And I think the House rules are just silent as to how changes to the manual are made. So maybe don't need a motion for that today, but something to think about as we move forward and present this to the bodies.
Gotcha. So in other words, we have to follow rule in the end, how we change this manual. So even though management council may look at this, they'll only do basically a recommendation back to the bodies and the rule committees. Is that an accurate statement, Matt?
Mr. Chairman, that's going to be my proposed course of action, as Management Council will make a recommendation to the House and Senate Rules Committee sitting jointly at the beginning of the session. We'll handle that in the meeting where changes to the House or the joint rules are also discussed, and then bring those recommendations back to the bodies.
Sounds good. Thank you, Matt. Now, Dave, what do we have for any cleanup before we get to proxy?
Mr. Chairman, I have some notes that you want information on, but I don't have any cleanup other than the proxy.
Very good. Senator Cost.
In my notes, was there something on page 4 that we needed to do? I thought David said something about something on page 4. Maybe I misinterpreted that when I was writing my notes.
Dave, you got anything?
Mr. Chairman, I have an amendment that you adopted on page 4, but that I think was part of your global amendment to adopt all the suggested amendments. That's the only thing I have.
Okay.
You know, Mr. Chairman, on page 5, you discussed at the end of the first full paragraph, on occasion, a standing committee amendment will need such extensive rewrite that the chairman will ask the House to vote against the standing committee amendment. And right now it reads, and prepare a second reading amendment. And I think you discussed inserting committee of the whole or a second reading amendment there. That was all I had close to there.
I think I thought we did that as a technical correction, right? Didn't I kind of go hold the group?
Yeah, I think we can do that as a technical correction.
Correct. All right. I see nods. I don't see any adverse shakes, so I think we'll just go ahead with that. If not, let's pop back up on the screen the proxy versus absentee options, if that's possible, whatever page that was on.
Katie, it's M4.
All right. And committee, I believe somebody had a motion on proxies. And so whoever, Senator Rothfuss, I think it was you that had that you wanted to get rid of proxy. Would you like to make a motion on that?
Yeah, Mr. Chairman, I would move to delete the word proxy or and capitalized absentee, and then conform in all of the provisions. And I'll stop there on the motion.
Second, that we're not going to deal with the word proxy. All those in favor, second by Landon. All those in favor, say aye or raise your hand. There we go. Motion passes. Now let's pop back to that and let's choose which option we want to do. So Katie, if you could run your magic again, I'd appreciate it. Thank you. So once again, it seems like the first one is subject to the chair. Second one is absentee voting shall not be permitted. And the third one now would be absentee voting in joint interim committee shall only be allowed for members who have attended a substantial portion of the committee's discussion of the issue. And obviously that could also be at the committee's at the chairman's discretion, whether that's allowed, I guess, if you wanted to have another option. So does anybody have a preference on these options? I obviously think you should be able to have an absentee vote. I agree that you should be around to hear it, but I think there have been times when people were pretty sure they wanted to vote on something with no amendments. And so Senator Rothfuss, do you have a motion?
Well, Mr. Chairman, I just had a question on this. So the way this reads is this is under sample rules. It's not binding, and it's simply a list of 3 options for alternatives that an interim committee could use for their proxy voting interim committee rules to incorporate as an alternative to the sample rules, which are in the rules. So the only way that anything we're doing right now would be binding is if we actually put them into the joint rules instead of here in the manual, unless I'm not understanding what we're doing. So that's my question. I believe these are suggestions of alternatives, and we're contemplating whether we want to include these suggestions as possible alternatives. Is that accurate, or am I missing something?
Dave, I'm just reading down below the staff comment. The staff comment included that the question of proxy voting is not clearly addressed by rule or procedures manual. But as far as absentee voting, my recollection of the original discussion is it's been kind of all over the place. And so, Dave, maybe remind us again where we're at.
Okay, Mr. Chairman, I'll go backwards. You're right, it's been all over the place. Folks have done different things depending on the situation. Addressing Senator Rothfuss, I actually think it'd be best if it were in rule for a couple of reasons. In rule, it's real clear that the bodies have voted on it, even though the bodies vote on the manual. You always have the issue of, is this management council telling committees of the legislature what they can and cannot do? If it's in rule, it's real clear. So I think you could put it in the manual, Senator, and you're right, it shouldn't be under sample rules. It should be in the provision of the manual by itself, putting restrictions on interim committee rules. And then, Mr. Chairman, if you get to the point, I think I have scripted together what I think reflects the view of a majority of the members of the committee for a motion. And whether you put that in rule or whether you put that in a separate provision of the manual legislative procedures, I'll leave to you, and I'll turn it over to Matt.
Okay, Senator Cost, and then I'll go to Matt.
Okay, and if I was to make a suggestion, and this is just a suggestion, I'd like to remove the first one and have the other two as the options, period. But I feel like that's the better way to look at that. And if we put it in rules, that's a decision, and I'm not going to say yay or nay to. I think it's better to have it as a rule, but I'll listen to the other discussion.
Senator Landon, a longtime chairman.
Yeah, Mr. Chairman, thank you. The minute you take off down this road, you can find all kinds of things in your mind. But several situations where we have adequately discussed the bill and plan to take it to a third meeting, for example, during an interim. The bill is all but put to bed, but just needs a couple of minor tweaks. And you have a situation where one of your committee members can't be there on the first day of that committee meeting, but really wants to vote on that bill. It just feels like to me that we're okay to give discretion to our chairman. Most chairmen, including me, don't really like to allow absentee votes unless there's a very good reason, or we're convinced that the bill hasn't been changed enough that the vote stands. But boy, I hate to take discretion away from the chairman, because in a situation like I described, it might be perfectly reasonable to allow a vote in that third meeting, for example. So just a thought.
I agree. I think the challenge has been, Senator, is, has it been fairly adjudicated always? That's the question. I think, should the chairman, then if we look at the number one, should the chairman announce at the first regularly scheduled meeting how he's going to handle absentee votes? In general, I think that should be announced. That the chairman should be forced to kind of make a decision and not change the game in midstream, to fairness.
You know, you're absolutely right, Mr. Chairman, and I agree with that. And I would suggest that the chairman maybe haven't been as diligent on that front as we should have been. You know, we just march right into interim work, and I'm not sure that's ever been made clear. I'm good to go with the will of the subcommittee with what we take forward to management council, and I'm good with 2 or 3 being the primary mode of operation. So, you know, just trying to point out that there are all kinds of circumstances. But that's exactly what I think Mr. Gruber is cautioning us on, is that you can go all over the map here, and it might be good for us to consider just tightening this down a little bit, saying, you know, in general, we don't allow absentee voting. And
Senator Cost.
Well, and with respect to Senator Landon's comment, the third one doesn't say that substantial portion of the committee's discussion didn't take place in any other sessions. So I think the appropriateness of it is, have they been there for 1 or 2 of the sessions where they actually were involved with the decisions? It doesn't mean the one they're going to take the vote on necessarily. So I see that as flexibility in there. As to, I mean, who defines substantial? To me, substantial is, have you been there for 1 or 2 so you have the knowledge of the area? I don't know. I really struggle with, I have seen it, I've been involved with it, when somebody just turns in an absentee ballot, but haven't been there, haven't heard anything, and that really disturbs me. You're not doing your part, I don't think, when you do that.
So just my 10 cents, committee, and I don't know if I care that much about it, but I would combine 1 and 3, and I would do voting in joint committees subject to the discretion of the chairman. In exercising the discretion, the chairman shall announce the standard at the first regularly scheduled meeting of the committee and apply the same standard throughout the interim. And then I would add in, voting in joint interim committees shall only be allowed for members who have attended a substantial portion of the committee's discussion on the issue. So kind of a combination there, but I think if a chairman wants to make a decision not to allow absentee voting at all in his committee, I think that should be within his discretion. That's my 10 cents. Senator Landon?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And that actually was the motion I was going to make, what you just said there. So I would make that motion.
Is there a second? Second by Cost. So one, I'm going to go back to staff for any comments. Dave or Matt on this? Maybe they aren't there. I don't know.
No, Mr. Chairman, we're here. Just so everybody's clear, would you mind if I just write down what I think the motion is now?
Sure, please.
And I'm adding a little bit to it, but we'll start with, just to make it clear, proxy voting shall not be permitted in joint interim committees, period. Absentee voting in joint interim committees, and then we carry all the way through, subject to the discretion of the chairman, all the way through that sentence. And then after the end of that sentence, absentee voting in joint interim committees shall only be allowed for members who have attended a substantial portion of the committee's discussion of the issue. And the only point I'd make there is it is of the issue. So Senator Landon, if you attended the first 2 meetings and the bill didn't come up until the 3rd, I think a chairman would be well within their discretion to say, hey, they know what the issue was. They don't care really about the exact language. They're voting yes or no on this bill because it is the issue and not the bill. And I think that captures everyone's intent.
Does that sound good with the bringer of the motion, Senator Landon?
Mr. Chairman, I think we've clarified pretty well, and I would feel comfortable going forward with that to the Management Council, and I'm sure there'll be a little bit of a conversation there. So I'm good with it.
Second's good. Senator Rothfuss or Rep. Yin, you've been quiet on this, so interested in your thoughts. Senator Rothfuss.
I think it's a good approach. I think that it probably needs to end up being a rule for it to really carry, but I think putting it here at this point is appropriate. And honestly, I agree kind of with all of the concerns that it's a challenging space, but hopefully this threads the needle. It's better than what we've got.
All right. Rep Yin.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I agree. I do think it also needs to be in a rule. However, I think it might not be possible for us to get it passed through our houses as a joint rule. And so I'm perfectly fine with having it here anyways.
All right. All those in Senator Landon.
My apologies, Mr. Chairman. Just as a point of order, we're trying to eliminate the word proxy, and we would need to do that on the header at the bottom of M3. That would just simply say absentee voting versus proxy voting. Just wanted to point that out.
Yeah, we'll let staff, Senator Landon, we'll let staff do cleanup. It might say proxy and absentee voting because we will actually have a section that proxy is not allowed. But we'll let them do cleanup on that. So all those in favor of this motion signify by raising your hand. Motion carries. I guess, Dave, where are we at now?
Mr. Chairman, I guess what we can do is go through some of the provisions that I have that you want additional information on. I don't know that there are changes to be made. Maybe they'll result in changes. And then Matt, I would suggest anything I missed, he can add. One, you want more information on the number of amendments and how they've increased, decreased over time?
Yeah, which has nothing to do with what we're doing right now, but ultimately it could lead to, I think it's just good information for us to have.
Okay. Then you have a discussion issue for, I guess, LSO to bring in your report to the Management Council on the joint rule change for adoption of new rules. And the question of whether Senate Rule 1210A regarding reconsideration, Committee of the Whole should be an exception in the House for that reconsideration and handle it that way instead of splitting Committee of the Whole report.
Yeah, committee, as I think about that, obviously that's a House thing, but I think it's something just if note to self, right? I think if Matt, if you make sure that you remind somebody on the House side about this issue, then we can kind of have that discussion at the time. I don't think it's necessarily a Management Council, recommendation back. It's not a joint thing. I mean, you could make it a joint rule, but I don't think that's appropriate either. So,
Mr. Chairman, I'll stop there and let Matt add in anything as I flip through the rules and see if there are other things that you had that you wanted information on.
Mr. Chairman, I did not have any additions to Dave's list.
okay, sounds good. Well, unless it sounded like the others is just maybe, I think there might have been one other rule or something that we just noted. I don't think it was any change to the manual. So. All right, then we'll have to vote on go ahead, Senator Landon.
I didn't mean to interrupt, but before we depart today, I just thought it might be helpful to reiterate where we go from here and what maybe Director Obrecht can help us know when and if this will be presented, and just want to do an adequate job of representing the subcommittee and marching this on through. So that would be helpful to just remind on that front.
Okay, we still have the original motion on the floor, which is to adopt to recommend the adoption of the legislative manual subject to the changes we did with all of our amendments. So that motion's still there. Any comments? Nope. All those in favor of sending forth these recommendations, raise your hand. Opposed, motion carries. Okay, Matt, now on to Senator Landon's question.
And Senator, based on the actions of the subcommittee today, besides the fact that Representative Harshman wasn't able to join us, I don't know if it's necessary for you to meet again. We can work on your requested action items today and provide you with updated material on that. I guess Chairman Landon and Chairman Summers can decide at that time whether another short meeting of this subcommittee is needed before we go to Management Council. Management Council right now is planning on meeting sometime in likely the end of September, maybe beginning of October. A date hasn't been set yet, and the agenda hasn't been developed for that meeting yet. Whether this issue is on at that meeting or whether it waits for the December meeting, probably just needs some coordination between Chairman Dockstetter, Vice Chairman Barlow, and the chairman of this subcommittee on when that'll work better. At that time, whatever recommendation of Management Council, as noted earlier, will then go to the Joint Rules Committees for their consideration on those first few days of session for presentation to the bodies.
Mr. Chairman, want to thank the director for helping us understand where it goes from here. And we have a couple of good representatives to the Management Council. I'm sure I speak for the subcommittee. If needed, we'll be there along the way, but appreciate the efforts of everyone. I want to thank Mr. Groover especially. Thanks.
Yeah, Dave, thank you very much for all your hard work on this and your knowledge. And Matt, thank you for getting this done. It's a good thing to do. So thanks to all. If there's no other comments, I guess we'll just say meeting adjourned.
Mr. Chairman?
Please, Dave.
As I went through, there are two things. One, which you talked about bringing up as an issue for Management Council, and whether the House should consider adding the rule that the Senate has on germaneness, 11-6 in the Senate. I don't know if you want to put that in your report or not. I had that as a note. And the other one was Senator Rothfuss. I view it as a technical correction. Ayes and noes in the Committee of the Whole. We need to add, other than reconsideration, in the Committee of the Whole in the Senate.
You know, the germane issue, I mean, our established practice is to just, we call a rules committee. It's well established that it's historical. It's going to be in the procedures. I don't know that we need to mess with it in rule. It's so well established.
This is Chris on that. If we had your established tradition, I wouldn't have created that rule. We did not do it that way. And so we needed to change our rule so that we would actually do it the way the House did it. I don't think you've got a problem.
All right. Anything else for the good of the order?
Mr. Chairman, good luck. Get out there and get the hay put up. Thanks much, everybody.
All right. Take care. Meeting adjourned. Thank you.
Thanks, everyone. Good to see you all.